that suburban cul-de-sac knows there is a rhythm to the mornings. Garage doors opening at 6:15, the distant hum of lawn sprinklers, the same golden retriever being walked by the same retired man at the same hour every single day. My neighborhood in Raleigh, North Carolina, had perfected this monotony over the 12 years since I bought my house, fresh off my divorce and desperate for something uneventful. By 36, I had seen enough chaos to last a lifetime, between failed relationships and a corporate job that nearly gave me an ulcer. So when I moved into a cookie-cutter house on Birchwood Lane, I wanted nothing more than predictable neighbors and forgettable weekends. That March morning started like any other, except I woke up 10 minutes before my alarm to the unmistakable pulse of red and blue lights bleeding through my bedroom blinds. I sat up in bed, disoriented, my dog Murphy already alert at the window with his ears perked forward. The clock on my nightstand read 5:42, which meant something was wrong because nothing ever happened on our street before 7. I shuffled to the window and pulled back the curtain, expecting maybe a fender bender or a medical emergency at one of the older residents' homes. Instead, I counted 3 police cruisers parked diagonally across the road, their lights still spinning but their sirens mercifully silent. 2 unmarked sedans sat further down, and I could see officers gathered on the sidewalk about 2 houses down from mine, right in front of the Prescott's place. Warren and Denise Prescott had moved in maybe 4 years ago, a couple in their late 40s who kept mostly to themselves. They waved when they saw you, they kept their lawn immaculate, and Warren once helped me jump my truck battery during a particularly brutal January. Standing there in my boxers, watching the police tape go up, I remember thinking that something must have happened to one of them. Maybe a heart attack, maybe a fall. By 7:30, I had thrown on jeans and a sweatshirt and taken Murphy out for his morning walk, partly because he needed it, and partly because I am not above admitting I wanted to see what was happening up close. The whole street had come alive by then, neighbors clustered in small groups on their driveways, arms crossed, voices low. I recognized the Chavezes from across the street, and old Mr. Gunderson who lived on the corner and seemed to know everything about everyone. He was the one who told me, his face pale beneath his fishing cap, that Denise Prescott had not come home the night before. Warren had called the police around 3 in the morning after waiting up for her, convinced something terrible had happened. According to Gunderson, Denise had gone to her book club meeting at a friend's house around 7 the previous evening and never returned. Her car, a silver Subaru Outback, was still missing. Warren was apparently inside the house with detectives, and he had been in there for hours already. I walked Murphy past the Prescott house slowly, not wanting to seem like a vulture but unable to look away. The front door was open, and I could see figures moving inside, the occasional flash of a camera. Yellow crime scene tape stretched across the driveway entrance, and a female officer stood guard near the mailbox, her expression unreadable behind dark sunglasses. Warren Prescott was nowhere to be seen, but I noticed his black Ford pickup was parked in its usual spot, recently washed and gleaming despite the grim circumstances. I found myself staring at it for reasons I could not explain. Something about how clean it looked compared to the chaos unfolding around it. Murphy tugged at the leash, eager to continue his route, and I let him pull me forward. But I kept glancing back, this strange tightness forming in my chest, like my body knew something my brain had not figured out yet. The detectives came to my door around noon. There were 2 of them, a tall woman with short gray hair, and a younger guy with a notebook who barely said a word the entire time. The woman introduced herself as Detective Carla Finch and asked if I had a few minutes to answer some questions about my neighbors. I invited them in, offered coffee, which they declined, and we sat in my living room while Murphy watched from his bed in the corner, unusually quiet. Detective Finch started with the basics. How long had I lived here? How well did I know the Prescotts? When was the last time I had seen Denise? I answered everything as best I could, explaining that I was friendly with them but not close, that I had waved to Denise maybe 3 days ago when she was getting her mail. Then Finch leaned forward slightly, her eyes fixed on mine, and asked me something that made the room feel smaller. She wanted to know if I had ever heard yelling coming from their house, raised voices, anything that sounded like an argument. I told her the truth, which was that I had heard them arguing a handful of times over the years, but nothing that seemed out of the ordinary for a married couple. Voices carry in these houses. The walls are not as thick as the builders would have you believe, and sometimes late at night you catch fragments of conversations you were never meant to hear. Finch nodded slowly, scribbling something in her own notebook now, and then she asked about the nights leading up to Denise's disappearance. Had I noticed anything unusual, any lights on at strange hours, any activity in their driveway late at night? That question hit different because now that she mentioned it, I had noticed something. About 4 nights before, I had gotten up around 2 in the morning to use the bathroom, and through my window I had seen Warren loading something into the bed of his truck. It was dark and I was half asleep, but I remembered thinking it was odd because he was carrying what looked like heavy contractor bags, the thick black kind, and he made multiple trips from the garage to the truck. I had assumed he was cleaning out junk, maybe heading to the dump early the next morning. Now, sitting across from Detective Finch, I felt a cold wave wash through me as I recounted this detail. Detective Finch exchanged a glance with her partner that lasted maybe half a second, but it was enough to tell me everything I needed to know. She asked me to describe exactly what I had seen, the size of the bags, how Warren had moved, whether the garage light was on or off. I did my best explaining that the bags looked full and heavy based on how he carried them, that he had made at least 3 or 4 trips, and that he had worked quickly like a man who did not want to be seen. The garage light had been off, I remembered now, and he had used only the dim glow from a flashlight to navigate. When I finished, Finch thanked me and handed me her card, asking me to call if I remembered anything else. After they left, I stood in my kitchen for a long time, staring out the window at the Prescott house, trying to reconcile the Warren I knew with the image forming in my mind. This was a man who had shoveled my driveway without being asked during a snowstorm 2 winters ago. This was a man who brought over banana bread when I first moved in. And now I was telling police that I had watched him load mysterious bags into his truck in the dead of night, just days before his wife vanished. The next 3 days crawled by in a haze of anxiety and obsessive observation. I found myself watching the Prescott house constantly, noting every car that came and went, every time Warren stepped outside to collect his newspaper or stand on his porch looking lost. The police presence had thinned but not disappeared entirely, and news vans had started parking at the end of the street, their satellite dishes pointed at the sky like mechanical sunflowers. Denise's face was everywhere now, on the local news, on flyers that volunteers posted at gas stations and grocery stores, on a Facebook page someone had created called Find Denise Prescott. Her silver Subaru had been found abandoned in a parking lot near the Neuse River, about 20 miles from our neighborhood, and that discovery seemed to shift something in the investigation. The news anchors started using phrases like person of interest without naming names, but everyone on Birchwood Lane knew exactly who they meant. Warren stopped coming outside after that. His curtains stayed drawn, his truck unmoved, and the banana bread neighbor I thought I knew became a shadow behind glass. It was on the 5th day after Denise's disappearance that I made the discovery. I had taken Murphy on our usual evening walk, trying to stick to our routine despite everything, and we wandered toward the small community garden at the back of the neighborhood. It was a shared space where a dozen families kept vegetable plots, bordered by a wooden fence and a strip of untended land that backed up against a drainage ditch. Murphy loved sniffing around there, and I usually let him explore while I checked my phone or just breathed in the quiet. That evening, he pulled me toward the far edge of the garden, past the tomato cages and the compost bins, toward a patch of ground I had never paid much attention to before. It was behind a row of overgrown azalea bushes, hidden from casual view, and Murphy was digging at the dirt with an intensity that made me uneasy. I pulled him back and looked at what had caught his attention. The ground there was different from the surrounding area, darker and slightly sunken, like something had been buried and the earth had settled. There were no leaves or debris on that patch, even though everything around it was covered in the usual garden mulch and fallen twigs. I stood there for what felt like 10 minutes, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Part of me wanted to walk away, to convince myself it was nothing, maybe just a spot where someone had dug up a dead plant or buried kitchen scraps for compost. But the shape of it was wrong. Too long and narrow, roughly 6 feet from end to end. I thought about the contractor bags Warren had loaded into his truck, how heavy they had looked, how he had worked in the dark like a man with something to hide. I thought about Denise, her smiling face on all those flyers, her car abandoned by the river. My hands fumbled for my phone, and I dialed Detective Finch's number before I could talk myself out of it. She answered on the third ring, and I told her what I had found, my voice cracking as I described the location. She told me not to touch anything, to go home and wait, that she would send someone immediately. I walked back to my house in a daze, Murphy trotting beside me like nothing had happened, and I sat on my porch watching the sun go down, waiting for the sirens I knew would come. The police arrived within the hour, a whole convoy of them, and they blocked off the entrance to the community garden with tape and floodlights. I watched from my backyard as they worked through the night, their silhouettes moving against the artificial brightness like figures in a nightmare. Detective Finch came to my door around 11 to ask me a few follow-up questions and to thank me for calling it in. She did not tell me what they had found, but her face told me enough. The next morning, the news confirmed what I already knew in my gut. Human remains had been recovered from behind the community garden, and while official identification was pending, sources close to the investigation believed it was Denise Prescott. Warren was taken into custody that same afternoon, led out of his house in handcuffs while the neighbors watched in stunned silence. I saw him walk past the spot where he had helped me jump my truck battery, past the driveway where he had waved at me 100 times and he never once looked up. His face was blank, empty, like whatever human thing had lived behind his eyes had packed up and left a long time ago. The timeline Warren had given police fell apart completely once they started digging, both literally and figuratively. He had claimed Denise left for her book club at 7 and never came home, but her friend from the book club told detectives that Denise had canceled that evening, saying she was not feeling well. Phone records showed Denise had been home all night. Neighbors on the other side of the Prescotts, people I had never spoken to, came forward saying they had heard a loud argument around 9 that evening, followed by a heavy thud, and then silence. I learned later that the contractor bags I had seen Warren loading contained not just Denise, but also the bloody carpet from their bedroom and the clothes he had been wearing. He had driven to the garden that same night, buried everything in a shallow grave he thought no one would ever find, then spent the next few days washing his truck and rehearsing his story. The trial lasted 3 weeks. I testified about what I had seen through my window, about the bags in the darkness and the way he had moved like a man racing against the sunrise. Warren was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. I still live on Birchwood Lane because I could not afford to move, and because part of me refused to let what happened drive me out of my home. But I never walk past that garden anymore, and some nights, when I cannot sleep, I stand at my window and stare at the Prescott house, now empty and slowly falling into disrepair, and I wonder how many secrets hide behind the walls of quiet suburban streets, waiting for someone to notice the wrong thing at the wrong time. September of 2018 found me in a place most people dream about, but rarely reach. My husband Kevin and I had just closed on our first house in a quiet suburb outside of Denver, Colorado. One of those neighborhoods where everyone waves from their driveways and kids still ride bikes until the streetlights come on. Turning 30 that spring had felt like crossing some invisible finish line, and buying this house cemented the feeling that we had finally made it. Kevin worked as a regional sales manager for a medical equipment company, which meant he traveled often, sometimes for days at a time. I worked remotely as a content strategist for a tech startup, so I spent most of my hours alone in our new home, getting used to its creaks and settling sounds. We had been living there for about 3 months when this happened, long enough to feel comfortable but not quite long enough to know every noise the house made. That particular Thursday started like any other day when Kevin was on the road. He had flown out to Minneapolis early Monday morning for a conference that would keep him busy until Saturday. We had our little routine down by then, texting throughout the day and doing a video call before bed every night. The house sat at the end of Birchwood Lane, a cul-de-sac with only 4 other homes, all spaced generously apart with mature trees providing privacy between properties. Our nearest neighbor, an elderly widow named Dorothy, lived about 50 yards away, her porch light the only visible glow from our windows at night. I remember feeling so safe there, so insulated from the chaos of the world. That Thursday evening, I made myself a simple dinner, watched some show I cannot even remember now, and headed upstairs around 10 to get ready for bed. Kevin and I did our nightly video call. He showed me the boring hotel room, complained about conference food, and we said goodnight around 11. I plugged in my phone, turned off the lamp, and fell asleep faster than usual. Something pulled me out of sleep around 2 in the morning. Not a dream. Not a need to use the bathroom, just this sudden alertness like my brain had registered something before my conscious mind caught up. I lay there in the dark, eyes open, staring at the ceiling fan spinning lazily above me. The house was silent in that heavy way houses get in the middle of the night, when even the refrigerator hum seems amplified. I was about to close my eyes and drift off again when I heard it. A distinct creak from somewhere above me. We had a finished attic that we used for storage, accessible through a pull-down ladder in the upstairs hallway. My first thought, the one that made perfect sense in my sleepy brain, was that Kevin had come home early to surprise me. He had done that once before, cutting a trip short because he missed me. I smiled in the dark, already composing the teasing text I would send him about trying to be sneaky. Then I heard another footstep, heavier this time, directly over the bedroom. I sat up slowly, ears straining in the darkness. The footsteps continued, deliberate and measured, crossing from one side of the attic to the other. They did not sound rushed or random like an animal would make. These were human footsteps, and they were pacing. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, and that is when the first real prickle of unease crept into my chest. Kevin would have texted me if he was coming home early. Kevin would have called out when he got inside. Kevin would not be walking around in the attic at 2 in the morning in complete darkness. I unlocked my phone and pulled up his contact, my thumb hovering over the call button. The footsteps stopped directly above the bedroom door. I held my breath, counting the seconds of silence, telling myself I was being ridiculous, that old houses make noises, that I was half asleep and imagining things. Then I heard the attic ladder unfold. The long, groaning creak of it being pulled down into the upstairs hallway, just 15 feet from my bedroom door. My entire body went cold. I did not scream, did not jump out of bed, did not do any of the things you imagine yourself doing in a situation like this. Instead, I became very still, very quiet, like some primal part of my brain had taken over and decided that invisibility was survival. I could hear the ladder settling into place, then the unmistakable sound of weight on the rungs, someone climbing down, one careful step at a time. I slid out of bed as silently as I could, my bare feet finding the carpet without a sound. The bedroom door was closed but not locked because we never locked interior doors. Why would we? This was our home. This was supposed to be safe. I crouched beside the bed on the far side, putting it between me and the door, and dialed 911. The screen seemed impossibly bright in the darkness, and I shielded it with my hand as it rang once, twice, then connected. The operator's voice was calm, professional, asking what my emergency was. I whispered so quietly I was not sure she could hear me at first. "Someone is in my house." I told her the address, my voice barely a breath. I could hear footsteps now in the hallway, slow and deliberate, the floorboards protesting under each step. The operator asked me to stay on the line, told me officers were being dispatched, asked if I could get to a safe room. I was already in the master bedroom, I told her, on the second floor, but the door did not have a lock. She told me to barricade it if I could, to stay hidden, to keep the line open. I crawled toward the door, phone pressed to my ear, and as gently as possible wedged our small reading chair under the handle. It would not hold against a determined push, but it was something. As I backed away from the door, I heard the footsteps stop just on the other side, close enough that I could hear breathing, slow, steady, controlled, not panicked, not hurried. Whoever was out there was in no rush at all. I pressed myself against the wall beside the closet and whispered to the operator that he was right outside my door. The operator's voice remained steady, a lifeline in the dark. She told me units were 4 minutes out, that I needed to stay quiet, stay hidden, not to engage. 4 minutes. It sounds like nothing when you say it out loud, but crouched against that wall in the pitch black with a stranger breathing on the other side of a hollow wooden door, 4 minutes stretched into something endless. I heard the doorknob turn slowly, the mechanism clicking as it rotated all the way to the right. Then pressure against the door, gentle at first, testing. The chair scraped an inch against the floor and held. Silence. I clamped my hand over my mouth to muffle my own breathing, tears streaming down my face without me even realizing I was crying. The operator kept asking if I was still there, and I could only manage the smallest sound of acknowledgement. Then the footsteps retreated from my door, moving further down the hallway. I heard another doorknob turn, the guest bedroom, then another, the bathroom. He was checking every room methodically, patiently, like he had all the time in the world. The operator told me she had confirmed my husband's location. Kevin was still in Minneapolis, checked into his hotel, his phone pinging from there just moments ago. It was not him. I already knew that, but hearing her say it made the reality crash down harder. There was a stranger in my home, someone who had been hiding in our attic, someone who had waited until the middle of the night to come down. The footsteps returned to the hallway, and I heard him stop at the top of the stairs. For a moment, everything went quiet. No movement, no breathing, nothing. Then I heard him descend, each step creaking under his weight, slow and unhurried. The operator told me to stay where I was, that officers were almost there, that I was doing everything right. I heard him reach the bottom of the stairs, heard him moving through the first floor now, opening cabinets, drawers, the refrigerator. The sounds were almost casual, domestic, as if he lived there and was simply looking for a midnight snack. It was that normalcy that terrified me more than anything else. Red and blue lights swept across the bedroom ceiling before I heard the sirens. The operator told me police were on scene, that I should stay put until they announced themselves. I heard car doors slam, muffled shouting from outside, then the front door being forced open with a crash that shook the whole house. Heavy boots pounded through the first floor, voices calling out commands, clearing rooms. The operator stayed on the line with me the entire time, her voice a steady anchor as chaos erupted downstairs. I heard them sweep through the kitchen, the living room, the dining area. Then footsteps on the stairs coming up fast and a loud voice announcing police presence. I called out that I was in the master bedroom, that the door was barricaded. An officer responded, telling me to stay calm, that they were coming to me. I pushed the chair aside with trembling hands and opened the door to find 2 officers with flashlights and drawn weapons, their faces tense but controlled. One of them, a woman with close-cropped gray hair and kind eyes, asked if I was hurt. I shook my head, unable to form words, and she guided me out of the room while her partner continued clearing the upstairs. They brought me downstairs and sat me on the living room couch, a blanket wrapped around my shoulders even though I was not cold. More officers moved through the house, checking closets, the basement, every possible hiding spot. The back door was open, the one that led from the kitchen to our small patio, and an officer was examining the frame with a flashlight. "That is how he got out," one of them said. The door had been unlocked from the inside. Someone radioed in that the perimeter was clear, that the subject had fled before they arrived. The woman officer sat down next to me and asked if I could describe what happened. I told her everything, the footsteps in the attic, the ladder coming down, the breathing outside my door, the sounds of him moving through my house like he owned it. She wrote it all down, her expression growing more serious with each detail. Then another officer came in from the hallway, holding something in a gloved hand. It was my phone, the one I had been using to call 911, still recording. I had dropped it at some point and forgotten. He said the line had stayed open the entire time, and dispatch had captured everything. A detective arrived about an hour later, a stocky man in his 50s named Reeves, who had the tired eyes of someone who had seen too much over too many years. He listened to the recording from the 911 call with me sitting right there, and I had to relive every moment of it in real time. The footsteps, the creaking ladder, the doorknob turning, the silence that followed. but it was what came at the end that made Detective Reeves lean forward and replay the audio 3 times. After the police had entered through the front, after all the shouting and chaos, there was a stretch of about 40 seconds where my phone had been lying on the floor near the bedroom door. In that window, just before an officer picked it up, the recording captured something none of us had heard in the moment. Breathing. Slow, deliberate, close to the microphone. Then a long exhale, almost like a sigh, directly into the phone. The intruder had walked right past it on his way out. He had seen it recording, and instead of running, he had stopped, leaned down and breathed into it. Like he wanted us to know he had been there, like he was leaving a signature. They searched the attic the next morning and found evidence that someone had been living up there. A sleeping bag tucked behind old boxes, empty water bottles, granola bar wrappers, a small flashlight. There was a window at the far end of the attic that led onto a section of roof, and from there, it would have been easy enough to climb down the oak tree that brushed against the back of the house. That is how he had been getting in and out. For how long, no one could say. Forensics found partial fingerprints on the water bottles, but no match in the system. The sleeping bag was generic, sold at dozens of stores across the state. They canvassed the neighborhood, talked to Dorothy and the other neighbors, but no one had seen anything unusual. Whoever he was, he had been careful, patient. He had watched Kevin leave for trips. He had known my routine. The thought that he might have been up there for days, maybe weeks, listening to me move through my own home, sleeping just above my head while I slept below, made me physically ill. I threw up twice that morning and could not stop shaking for hours. Kevin flew home that same day, cutting his trip short the moment I called him. We stayed in a hotel for 2 weeks while a security company installed new locks, motion sensors, cameras, and an alarm system that could wake the entire neighborhood. We sealed the attic window permanently and bolted the ladder access with a heavy padlock. Kevin wanted to sell the house immediately, but I refused. I know that sounds insane, but something in me could not let this stranger take that from us too. We had worked so hard for that house, dreamed about it for years, and I was not going to let one terrible night erase all of that. So we stayed, and slowly, painfully, I learned to sleep there again. It took months of therapy, a prescription for anti-anxiety medication, and a very patient husband who never once made me feel crazy for checking the attic 3 times before bed every single night. The case went cold after a few months. Detective Reeves called occasionally with updates that were never really updates, just reminders that whoever had been living in our attic was still out there somewhere. 6 years have passed since that night. We still live in the same house, though we have renovated the attic into a proper guest room with its own lock and security camera. I have never heard unexplained footsteps again. No one has ever come forward. No match has ever been found for those fingerprints, and the man who breathed into my phone remains a ghost in every sense but the literal one. Sometimes I wonder if he moved on to someone else's attic, someone else's life. Sometimes I wonder if he is in prison for something unrelated, or dead in a ditch somewhere, or living a perfectly normal existence 2 towns over. I will probably never know. What I do know is that I will never again assume that the sounds in my house are just the house settling. I will never again feel completely safe when Kevin travels. And every single night before I go to bed, I check the attic. I check the locks. I check the cameras. Because the worst part of what happened to me was not the fear I felt that night. It was learning that someone had been watching me, studying me, existing just above my head for God knows how long, and I had no idea. That kind of violation does not heal. You just learn to live with the scar. My neighbor Garrett once told me that owning a house means learning to sleep through noises that would have sent you dialing 911 in an apartment. He was right about that. After closing on my first place in March of 2018, a modest 3-bedroom in a quiet suburb outside Denver, I became intimately familiar with every creak and groan the structure could produce. The refrigerator cycling on, the water heater doing its thing, the foundation settling when temperatures dropped. My 10-year high school reunion had just passed, reminding me that most guys my age were married with kids by now. while I was spending my evenings assembling IKEA furniture alone and feeling pretty good about it. The house sat at the end of Birchwood Court, a cul-de-sac with 6 other homes, all occupied by families who waved politely but kept to themselves. I worked as a software engineer for a company downtown, which meant early mornings and sometimes staying late to meet deadlines. The commute was 40 minutes each way, but the neighborhood felt safe, the mortgage was reasonable, and I finally had a garage to store all the camping gear I kept promising myself I would use more often. The first time I heard the noise, I was deep asleep and my brain incorporated it into a dream about someone dropping silverware in a restaurant kitchen. When I finally surfaced into consciousness, the sound had stopped and my bedroom was silent except for the hum of the ceiling fan. I checked my phone, 3:17 in the morning. I lay there for maybe 10 minutes, ears straining, but nothing else came. The rational part of my brain immediately started cataloging explanations. The garage door tracks contracting in the cold, maybe a raccoon knocking something over outside, possibly the metal shelving unit I had installed the previous weekend settling under the weight of storage bins. Colorado nights in early spring could swing 30 degrees between afternoon and midnight, and I had read somewhere that temperature fluctuations cause all kinds of metal expansion and contraction. I remember thinking how annoying it would be if this became a regular thing, already dreading the sleep disruption. What I did not think, not even for a second, was that someone might be outside my house at 3 in the morning, testing whether my garage door would give. The noise came back 4 nights later, same metallic clanking, same approximate time, somewhere between 3 and 3:30. This time it pulled me out of sleep faster, and I caught the tail end of it, a faint scraping sound followed by 2 distinct clicks like someone tapping a wrench against a pipe. I sat up in bed, heart beating a little faster than I wanted to admit, and waited. Nothing. Complete silence. I grabbed my phone and opened the security app out of habit, but the camera I had installed only covered the front porch and part of the driveway. The garage sat on the left side of the house, completely out of frame. I made a mental note to buy another camera, then spent 20 minutes scrolling through the footage anyway, watching empty concrete and the occasional moth fluttering past the lens. By the time I convinced myself to go back to sleep, the sky was already starting to lighten. At work the next day, I mentioned it to a coworker named Dennis who had owned his home for over a decade. He laughed and said, "Welcome to homeownership," told me his attic sounded like a bowling alley every winter, and suggested I check if any of my garage shelving was loose. That weekend I inspected every inch of the garage. I tightened bolts on the metal shelving, checked the tracks on the automatic door, even crawled underneath my workbench to see if anything had fallen behind it. Everything looked fine. The side door that led to the backyard was locked with a deadbolt, same as always, and the main garage door sat flush against the concrete floor with no visible gaps. I stood there for a while, hands on my hips, feeling slightly foolish for being so thorough about what was probably just the house settling. The garage smelled like motor oil and cardboard boxes, completely ordinary, and sunlight streamed through the small window near the ceiling. Nothing sinister here, I told myself. Just an old structure doing old structure things. I went back inside, made some coffee, and spent the rest of the Saturday convincing myself that the whole thing was nothing. But that night, before going to bed, I found myself double-checking the lock on the side garage door for the first time since moving in. I told myself it was just being cautious. Responsible homeowner stuff. Deep down, though, something had shifted, a small seed of unease that I could not quite name. 2 weeks passed without incident and I started to relax. The night stayed quiet, my sleep improved, and I stopped checking the security app obsessively before bed. Work picked up with a major project deadline approaching, which meant I was staying at the office until 8 or 9 most evenings, sometimes grabbing dinner at my desk just to push through the workload. My car would not pull into the driveway until well after dark, and by then I was too exhausted to think about mysterious garage noises. I figured whatever had been causing the sound, thermal expansion, settling foundation, overactive imagination, had simply stopped. Problem solved without me having to do anything. I even joked about it with Garrett one afternoon when we were both checking our mailboxes, and he nodded knowingly and said every new homeowner goes through a paranoid phase. His words made me feel better, more grounded. I was just another guy adjusting to the responsibilities of owning property, jumping at shadows like everyone else did in their first year. The camera I had planned to buy for the garage stayed in my Amazon cart, unpurchased, because it no longer seemed necessary. Then came the night of April 19th. I remember the exact date because it was a Thursday, and Thursdays were the one day I left work early to play basketball at the rec center with some guys from college. My car was gone from the driveway between 6 and 10 in the evening. A predictable window, same every week, had been for months. I got home around 10:30, tired and sore from the game, and went straight to bed without even showering. The clanking woke me at 3:08, but this time it was different. This time it was louder, more deliberate, and it did not stop after a few seconds. I lay there in the dark, listening to a rhythmic scraping sound that went on for maybe 30 seconds, paused, then started again. Metal on metal, with a faint squeaking undertone that reminded me of someone prying open a paint can. My mouth went dry. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, hands unsteady, and pulled up the security app. The front porch camera showed nothing. Empty driveway, my car parked exactly where I had left it, streetlight casting its usual orange glow across the pavement. I do not know what made me get out of bed. Maybe it was weeks of accumulated frustration, or maybe some primal part of my brain had finally accepted what the rational part kept denying. I grabbed the aluminum baseball bat I kept in my closet, a relic from my high school days that I had never actually used for self-defense, and walked barefoot through the dark hallway toward the kitchen. The house was completely silent now. The scraping had stopped the moment I stood up, almost as if whoever or whatever was making it had sensed my movement. I stood by the back door for what felt like an eternity, bat raised, ears straining for any sound. Nothing. Just the hum of the refrigerator and my own pulse pounding in my temples. I wanted to open the door, to step outside and confront whatever was out there. But something held me back. Fear, yes, but also something else. A gut instinct telling me that walking into my backyard at 3 in the morning was exactly what I should not do. So I stood there, frozen by indecision, until the first gray light of dawn started creeping through the kitchen window. Only then did I lower the bat and let myself breathe. The next morning I called in sick to work and drove to Home Depot before they even opened. I sat in my car in the parking lot, scrolling through my phone, researching security cameras with night vision and motion detection. By noon, I had installed 2 new cameras, one pointed directly at the side garage door, another covering the back corner of the house near the fence. The system was wireless and connected to my phone, with alerts that would wake me up the second anything moved within range. I spent the rest of the day testing the angles, adjusting the sensitivity, making sure there were no blind spots. Garrett saw me on a ladder and wandered over, asking if everything was all right. I told him I was just upgrading security, nothing serious, but the look on my face must have said otherwise because he offered to keep an eye out for anything unusual. That night I went to bed with my phone on the pillow beside me, volume turned all the way up, and the bat leaning against my nightstand. I did not sleep well, but I slept, and for the first time in weeks, no sound woke me up. The cameras recorded 8 hours of absolute stillness, nothing but empty concrete and the occasional cat wandering through frame. Thursday came around again, and I almost skipped basketball. Almost. But I had already missed 2 weeks. The guys were counting on me, and I refused to let some random noise turn me into a prisoner in my own home. So I grabbed my gym bag, locked up the house, and drove to the rec center like I always did. The game ran late, one of those nights where everyone wanted to play one more round, and I did not get home until almost 11. I pulled into the driveway, hit the garage door opener, and sat in my car for a moment, scanning the darkness beyond my headlights. Everything looked normal. The motion lights on the side of the house had not been triggered. The garage door rolled up smoothly, and the backyard fence stood undisturbed. I parked inside, closed the garage behind me, and went to bed feeling almost silly about how paranoid I had become. The sound did not come that night. I woke up at 7 feeling rested for the first time in weeks, made coffee, and checked the security footage out of habit. That is when I saw him. The timestamp read 9:47 the previous evening. About an hour after I had left for basketball, a figure crouched beside the garage side door, barely visible in the infrared glow, holding something long and thin in his right hand. I replayed the footage maybe 20 times, each viewing making my stomach twist tighter. The man was wearing dark clothing, a hoodie pulled up over his head, and what looked like work gloves. He moved slowly, deliberately, like someone who had done this before and knew exactly how much time he had. The object in his hand was a screwdriver, at least 18 inches long, the kind mechanics use to reach deep into engine compartments. I watched him insert it into the gap between the door and the frame, wiggling it back and forth, applying pressure in short, controlled bursts. The motion explained the metallic scraping I had been hearing for weeks. He worked on the door for almost 4 minutes, checking periodically toward the street, before suddenly stopping and retreating into the shadows along my fence line. The camera lost him after that. He knew exactly where the blind spots were, which meant he had been watching long enough to map them out. But the detail that made me put down my coffee and just sit there, unable to move, was simpler than that. He had come on a Thursday night. He had come when my car was not in the driveway. He had been watching my routine closely enough to know exactly when I would be gone. I called the police within the hour. 2 officers arrived, a man and a woman, both looking slightly skeptical until I showed them the footage on my laptop. Their expressions changed immediately. The female officer, whose name tag read Fuentes, told me this was textbook pre-burglary surveillance, someone casing a house, learning the patterns, waiting for the right moment to make entry. She asked if I had noticed anyone unfamiliar in the neighborhood recently, any cars parked for too long, any strangers walking past more than once. I thought about it and came up empty. Whoever this guy was, he was careful. The male officer took a copy of the footage and said they would increase patrols in the area, but warned me that without a clear image of the suspect's face, there was not much they could do unless he was caught in the act. Before leaving, Officer Fuentes suggested I vary my routine, never leave at the same time twice, and consider adopting a large dog. She said it half-jokingly, but the look in her eyes was serious. That afternoon I called a locksmith and had every lock in the house replaced with high-security deadbolts. I installed a steel reinforcement plate on the garage side door and added a secondary latch that could only be opened from inside. The whole thing cost me almost $2,000, but I would have paid 10 times that amount for the ability to sleep at night. The following Thursday, I did not go to basketball. Instead, I parked my car 2 blocks away at Garrett's house. He agreed to help after I explained the situation, and sat in my dark living room with the curtains drawn, watching the security feed on my phone. The hours crawled by. 9 o'clock, nothing. 10 o'clock, nothing. By 11, I was starting to think he had given up, moved on to an easier target, found some other house with a predictable owner. Then at 11:34, the motion alert lit up my screen. There he was. Same hoodie, same gloves, same deliberate crouch beside my garage door. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the long screwdriver, positioned it against the frame, and started working. I had already dialed 911 before he finished his first pry. I gave the dispatcher my address, told her someone was actively trying to break into my garage, and watched on camera as the man worked for another 90 seconds before headlights swept across the street. He saw them too. He pulled back from the door, pocketed the screwdriver, and started walking casually toward the fence. But he was too slow. The patrol car that Officer Fuentes had promised turned onto Birchwood Court just as he reached the corner of my property. I watched him freeze in the spotlight, hands going up, and I finally let myself exhale. His name was Carl Bruner, 43 years old, and he lived in a rental house less than a mile from my neighborhood. The police found a notebook in his car with addresses, schedules, and notes about 6 different homes in the area. Mine was the 4th entry on the list. He had written down the days I left for basketball, the approximate times my lights went off at night, even a description of my car and license plate number. The detective who called me the following week said Bruner had a history of burglaries going back 15 years, mostly targeting single men living alone, because they were less likely to have security systems or dogs. He had been watching my house for almost 2 months before making his first attempt. 2 months of driving past, noting when I came and went, waiting for the perfect pattern to emerge. I testified at his trial 6 months later and he got 8 years. I moved out of that house before the lease on my sanity expired completely, sold it to a young couple who probably have no idea what almost happened in their garage. These days, I live in an apartment complex with a doorman and security cameras in every hallway. I still play basketball on Thursdays, but I take a different route home every single time, and I never park in the same spot twice. Some people might call that paranoid. I call it learning the hard way that the scariest monsters are not the ones hiding under your bed. They are the ones sitting in parked cars across the street, writing down your schedule in a notebook, waiting for the night you finally let your guard down. My sister had just gotten engaged when I moved into the duplex on Crescent Road, which made everyone in my family forget to worry about me for once. At 31, freshly divorced and learning how to exist in silence again, I figured a small place in a quiet neighborhood outside of Portland was exactly what I needed. The duplex was nothing fancy. 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen with laminate counters from the 80s, and a backyard the size of a parking spot. The other unit had been vacant for months, which the landlord mentioned like it was a selling point. "Peace and quiet," he said, handing me the keys on a Friday afternoon in late October. I worked remotely as a medical transcriptionist, so my days blurred together in a haze of audio files and coffee cups. The neighbors on either side were older couples who waved politely, but never lingered for conversation. I told myself this was healing. I told myself the emptiness in my chest would eventually fill with something other than the echo of my ex-husband's accusations. For the first 3 weeks, I slept better than I had in years. It started with the kitchen chair. I remember because it was a Monday, and I always did laundry on Mondays. One of those pointless routines that made me feel like I had some control over my life. When I walked into the kitchen that morning, one of the chairs at my small table was pulled out at an angle, like someone had just gotten up from eating breakfast. I stared at it for a solid minute, trying to remember if I had sat there the night before. I hadn't. I had eaten dinner on the couch watching some true crime documentary, the plate balanced on my knees. But I pushed the thought away, told myself I must have bumped it while half asleep getting water in the middle of the night. The brain does strange things when you live alone. You start second-guessing every small action because there's no one else to confirm your reality. I pushed the chair back in and poured my coffee, but I kept glancing at the table throughout the day. That night, before bed, I made a point of checking that all 4 chairs were tucked in neatly. I even took a photo on my phone, laughing at myself for being paranoid. When I woke up the next morning, the same chair was pulled out again at the exact same angle. I called my friend Natalie that afternoon, trying to make it sound like a joke. "I think I'm losing my mind," I said, and she laughed because that's what you do when someone says something like that. She suggested maybe I was sleepwalking, something I had never done before but seemed like a reasonable explanation. "Stress can rewire your brain," she said, and God knows the divorce had put me through enough. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe I was just a woman struggling to adjust, that my subconscious was playing tricks on me in the dark hours. But the next few days brought more inconsistencies. The cabinet above the stove, the one where I kept my rarely used baking supplies, was cracked open when I came downstairs on Wednesday. On Friday, the back doormat, a faded green rectangle I had bought at a thrift store, had shifted about an inch to the left. These were such small things, insignificant things, the kind of things you notice and then immediately question whether you notice them at all. I started taking photos of everything before bed, the chairs, the cabinets, the mat. Every morning I would compare, and every morning something was different. The weekend came and I barely slept. I lay in bed listening to the house settle, to the wind pushing against the windows, to the refrigerator humming its low mechanical song. Every creak made my heart pound. I thought about calling my mom, but she would just tell me to come stay with her, and I was too proud for that. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? Someone is moving my chairs? They would think I was crazy. Instead, I bought a cheap security camera online and set it up in the kitchen, angled toward the back door and the table. The first night, I watched the footage in the morning and saw nothing. Just 8 hours of stillness, my kitchen frozen in grayscale. The second night, same thing. By the third night, I had almost convinced myself that Natalie was right, that stress was making me see patterns in chaos. But then I noticed the camera had been moved, not much, maybe half an inch. Tilted slightly upward so it no longer captured the back door. Just the ceiling and the top of the refrigerator. I had not touched it. That was the moment I stopped doubting myself. Someone had been inside my house. Someone had stood in my kitchen while I slept upstairs and adjusted my camera so they wouldn't be recorded. The realization hit me like ice water. Not fear exactly, but something worse. A violation so intimate it made my skin feel like it didn't belong to me anymore. I checked every window, every door, all locked. I inspected the back door lock closely and noticed faint scratches around the keyhole, thin silver lines against the brass that I had never seen before. I called a locksmith that same day and had all the locks changed. New deadbolts, new keys, a chain lock on the back door for good measure. The locksmith was a quiet man named Howard with grease-stained fingers and kind eyes. He asked if everything was all right, and I lied and said I had just lost my keys. He didn't push. That night I slept with a kitchen knife on my nightstand and my phone clutched in my hand. I told myself the new locks would fix everything. I told myself whoever it was would find the doors impenetrable now and move on to an easier target. For 5 days, nothing happened. No moved chairs, no open cabinets. The mat stayed exactly where I left it. I started to breathe again. I even laughed at myself one morning, standing in the kitchen with my coffee, feeling foolish for the knife still sitting on my nightstand. Maybe it had been nothing. Maybe there was some rational explanation I couldn't see. A draft from the vents, the house settling in ways that shifted objects, my own exhausted mind filling in gaps with paranoia. I called Natalie and told her I thought it was over, whatever it had been. She said she was relieved, that she had been worried about me. On the 6th night, I went to bed without checking the doors twice. I didn't take photos. I didn't lie awake listening. I just slept, deeply and dreamlessly, the kind of sleep I hadn't had in weeks. And then, sometime around 3 in the morning, I woke to a sound, a soft thump, distant but unmistakable, the back door closing. I sat up in bed, my heart slamming against my ribs so hard I could hear it in my ears. For a long moment I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just listened, straining to hear anything else. Footsteps, breathing, the creak of a floorboard. Nothing. Just silence so thick it felt like pressure. My phone was in my hand before I realized I had grabbed it, and I dialed 911 with fingers that felt numb and clumsy. The dispatcher's voice was calm, almost too calm, asking me what my emergency was. I whispered that someone had been in my house, that I heard my back door close, that I was alone. She told me to stay in my room, to lock my bedroom door if I could, that officers were on their way. I didn't have a lock on my bedroom door, it was an old house, and the bedrooms just had those simple knobs with no mechanism. So I pushed my dresser in front of the door, the wooden legs scraping against the hardwood loud enough that if anyone was still inside, they would have heard me. I crouched in the corner between my bed and the wall, the kitchen knife in one hand and my phone in the other, watching the door like it might burst open at any second. The police arrived in what felt like hours, but was probably only 8 minutes. I heard them knock, heard them announce themselves, and I had to force myself to move the dresser and walk downstairs to let them in. There were 2 officers, a tall woman with a blonde ponytail pulled tight, and a shorter man with a thick mustache who looked like he had seen 100 calls like this. They searched the entire house, every room, every closet, even the small crawl space in the basement that I had never opened. Nothing. No one. The back door was unlocked, which they noted with serious expressions, but there was no sign of forced entry. No broken windows, no jimmied locks. The blonde officer, her name tag said Delgado, asked if I was sure I had locked the door before bed. I wanted to scream at her. Of course I was sure. I had checked it 3 times. I had new locks installed less than a week ago. but I just nodded, my voice stuck somewhere in my throat. They told me to call if anything else happened, gave me a case number, and left. I stood in my kitchen as the sun started to rise, feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life. The light came in slowly through the window above the sink, pale and gray like the sky couldn't commit to morning. I was still standing there, arms wrapped around myself, when I noticed it. At first I thought it was a shadow, some trick of the early light playing on the hardwood floor. But as the room grew brighter, the shape became unmistakable. A footprint. A single muddy footprint on the floor near the hallway entrance. The hallway that led to the stairs, that led to my bedroom. It was large, much larger than my own feet, with a distinct tread pattern pressed into the dried mud. I knelt down and stared at it, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The police had walked all over my house just hours ago, but their boots had been clean. I remembered noticing that, the way Officer Delgado had wiped her feet on the mat before stepping inside. This print was fresh. The mud was still slightly damp at the edges, and it was facing toward the hallway. Not toward the back door, like someone leaving. Toward my bedroom, like someone who had been walking deeper into the house. Toward me. I took a photo of the footprint and called the police again. A different officer came this time, a younger guy with a shaved head who looked barely old enough to drink. He examined the print, took his own photos, and asked me a series of questions that made me feel like I was the suspect. Did I have any enemies? Had I recently ended a relationship? Was there anyone who might have a key to my house? That last question hit me like a punch to the chest. The landlord. He would have a key, or at least he would have had a key before I changed the locks. But the locks were new, brand new, unless someone had made a copy before Howard installed them. Unless someone had been watching, had seen the locksmith leave, had known exactly when I felt safe enough to let my guard down. The officer said they would increase patrols in the area, that I should consider staying with a friend or family member for a few days. He didn't say they would catch whoever was doing this. He didn't promise me anything. After he left, I sat on my couch and stared at my phone, scrolling through my contacts trying to think of who I could call. My mom would panic. Natalie lived 40 minutes away. My sister was busy with wedding planning. I had never felt so completely, terrifyingly alone. That afternoon, I did something I should have done weeks earlier. I called my landlord, a man named Gene Whitfield, who I had only met once when signing the lease. He answered on the third ring, his voice gravelly like he had just woken up from a nap. I asked him as calmly as I could manage if anyone else had a key to my unit. There was a pause. Too long, I thought. Before he said no, just him. I told him about the break-ins, about the police, about the footprint. Another pause. Then he said something that made everything click into horrible, sickening place. You know the other unit isn't empty anymore, right? I rented it out about 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks. The same amount of time the disturbances had been happening. I asked who the tenant was, and Gene said he couldn't give out that information, privacy policy and all that. But he did say it was a single man, quiet, paid in cash, kept to himself. My hands went cold. A shared wall. A duplex with a shared wall and, I realized with growing horror, probably shared access points I had never thought to check. The attic, the basement. Old houses like this sometimes had connecting passages that were never properly sealed. I thanked Gene and hung up, my mind racing faster than I could keep up with. I didn't wait for the police this time. I grabbed my keys, my phone, and a bag with enough clothes for a few days, and I drove straight to Natalie's apartment. I didn't go back to that duplex alone, not ever. Natalie's boyfriend and 2 of his friends went with me 2 days later to get the rest of my things, and while they were loading boxes into the truck, one of them checked the basement. He found it. A door. Not a real door, but a panel in the drywall that had been cut and fitted back into place, hidden behind the water heater. It opened into the other unit's basement. There were blankets on the floor on the other side, empty food wrappers. A flashlight. The police arrested the man living next door that same week. His name was Elliot Bryce, 43 years old, with a history of stalking charges in 2 different states. He had been watching me through that panel, coming into my home at night, standing in my kitchen, walking toward my bedroom while I slept. The police said I was lucky. Lucky. I still have nightmares about that footprint, facing the hallway, facing me. I still check my locks 4 times before bed, even though I live in a new apartment now with Natalie as my roommate. Some nights I wake up at 3 in the morning, heart pounding, listening for the soft thump of a door. I don't think that feeling will ever go away. Cedar Ridge, Ohio became my home after my divorce finalized in 2016, right around my 10th high school reunion. I packed everything I owned into a rented truck and drove 6 hours to a small town where nobody knew my name or my history. I found a modest 2-bedroom house on Willow Creek Drive, the kind of place with a big backyard and neighbors who waved from their porches. My sister thought I was running away from my problems, but I called it reclaiming my peace. The first few weeks were quiet, almost too quiet, and I spent most of my time unpacking boxes and learning which floorboards creaked at night. I worked remotely as a technical writer, which meant I could live anywhere with decent internet, and Cedar Ridge had just enough civilization to keep me connected without feeling suffocated. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe without someone watching me do it wrong. I met Allison Kramer on my 3rd Saturday in the neighborhood. She came over with a plate of homemade brownies and a smile so wide it seemed to stretch beyond her face. Her blonde hair was always pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she had these pale blue eyes that reminded me of shallow water in the summer. What struck me immediately was how she dressed. Long sleeves even though it was the middle of June, and the humidity made everything stick to your skin. I remember thinking maybe she had a skin condition, or was just one of those people who ran cold no matter the weather. She told me she lived 3 houses down with her husband, Raymond, and that they had been in Cedar Ridge for almost 4 years. Allison had this nervous energy about her, like a bird that never quite settled on a branch, but her warmth was genuine. She invited me over for coffee the following Monday, and just like that, I had my first friend in town. Over the next 2 months, Allison and I became close. We had coffee together at least 3 times a week, sometimes at her place, sometimes at mine. She loved to bake and was constantly trying new recipes: lemon bars, cinnamon rolls, apple pie with a lattice crust so perfect it looked like it belonged in a magazine. Her house was immaculate, almost obsessively clean, with white furniture and beige carpets that never showed a single stain. Raymond worked long hours at some logistics company 2 towns over, so most of the time it was just Allison and me sitting in her kitchen while the afternoon sun poured through the windows. She asked me a lot about my divorce, about my ex-husband, about what it felt like to finally be free. There was something hungry in the way she listened, like she was collecting information for a test she knew was coming. I told her everything and she nodded along, but whenever I asked about her own marriage, she would change the subject or suddenly remember something she needed to do in the other room. I started noticing things, small things at first, the kind you brush off because you do not want to be the person who assumes the worst about everyone. One afternoon in July, Allison reached for the sugar bowl, and her sleeve rode up just enough for me to see a bruise on her forearm. Purple and yellow at the edges, the kind that takes weeks to fade. She caught me looking and pulled her sleeve down so fast it was like a reflex she had practiced 1,000 times. I did not say anything because I did not know how, and she smiled and kept talking about her grandmother's shortbread recipe like nothing had happened. Another time, I stopped by unannounced and heard Raymond's voice through the screen door. Low and sharp, the words unclear but the tone unmistakable. When Allison answered the door, her eyes were red and she told me it was allergies. It was the middle of summer and nothing was blooming. I wanted to ask, I wanted to push, but something in her expression told me she was not ready to let me in that far. On a Wednesday evening in late August, Allison texted me around 7. She said she wanted to talk, that there was something she had been meaning to tell me for a while, but never found the right moment. I told her to come over whenever she was ready, and she replied with a simple, "Tomorrow," followed by a heart emoji. That was the last message I ever received from her. I texted her the next morning asking what time worked for her, but there was no response. By noon, I had sent 3 more messages, each one a little more concerned than the last. Her phone showed the messages as delivered but not read, which was unusual because Allison was the kind of person who replied within minutes, sometimes seconds. I called twice and it went straight to voicemail both times. By the time the sun started setting, I had this tight feeling in my chest that I could not explain. Like my body knew something my mind was still refusing to accept. Friday morning, I walked down to her house. Her silver Toyota Camry was parked in the driveway, same spot as always, and the curtains in the front windows were drawn tight. I knocked on the door and waited, listening for footsteps or voices or any sign of life inside. After a minute, the door opened and Raymond stood there in a gray t-shirt and jeans, his hair uncombed and his face carrying the expression of someone who had been interrupted. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with hands that looked like they could crush a beer can without trying. I had only met him a handful of times before, always briefly, and each time he had this way of looking at me like he was measuring something, my height, my weight, how much trouble I might cause. I asked if Allison was home and he shook his head slowly, almost like he was savoring the moment. She left yesterday, he said. Went to visit her sister in Michigan, family emergency. I asked why she had not told me, why she had not texted, and he shrugged and said she left in a hurry. Then he looked past me at the empty street and said she probably would not be back for a while. Something about the way he said it made me walk home faster than I needed to. I kept thinking about her car sitting in that driveway, about the text she sent saying she wanted to tell me something important, about the fact that she had never once mentioned a sister in Michigan in all the hours we spent talking. That night I barely slept. I kept replaying every conversation we had ever had, searching for clues I might have missed, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. People leave suddenly all the time, I told myself. Emergencies happen. But then I remembered the bruises, the red eyes, the way she flinched when Raymond's truck pulled into the driveway while we were sitting on her porch. By morning, I had made a decision that felt both necessary and terrifying. I was going to the police. I drove to the Cedar Ridge station, a small brick building next to the post office, and walked inside with my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. A woman at the front desk asked how she could help me, and I told her I was worried about my neighbor, that something did not add up, that I thought she might be in danger. The officer who took my statement was a man named Douglas Holt, maybe late 40s, with a thick mustache and the kind of tired eyes that suggested he had heard every story imaginable in this small town. I told him everything, the bruises, the long sleeves, Raymond's explanation, the car still in the driveway, the text message about wanting to talk. He wrote it all down in a small notebook, nodding occasionally but not saying much. When I finished, he set his pen down and looked at me for a long moment before speaking. He asked if I knew anything about Raymond Kramer's history, and when I said no, he leaned back in his chair and told me something that made the room feel smaller. Raymond had been married twice before. His first wife, a woman named Christine, disappeared in 2009 after telling friends she was planning to leave him. The official story was that she ran off with another man, but her family never believed it, and her body was never found. His second wife, Megan, left in 2012 under similar circumstances, packed a bag in the middle of the night, according to Raymond, and was never seen again. Officer Holt said there had been investigations, suspicions, but never enough evidence to charge him with anything. He looked at me with an expression that was equal parts warning and apology, and told me to be careful. I drove home with the windows down, needing the air, needing something to anchor me to the real world because everything suddenly felt like it was tilting sideways. 3 wives. 3 women who vanished without a trace, all married to the same man, all living in houses with pristine white furniture and beige carpets that never showed a stain. I thought about Allison's nervous energy, the way she always seemed to be listening for something, the hunger in her eyes when I talked about freedom. She had been planning to leave him. That had to be what she wanted to tell me. Maybe she had found proof of what he had done, or maybe she had simply reached her breaking point. Either way, she never got the chance. When I pulled into my driveway, I noticed Raymond standing in his front yard 3 houses down, just standing there with his arms crossed, watching me. He did not wave, did not move, just watched. I went inside and locked every door, checked every window, and sat in my living room with the lights off until the sun went down. A week passed with no word from Allison. I called her phone every day and it always went to voicemail, her cheerful voice asking me to leave a message that I knew she would never hear. The police told me they were looking into it, that they had contacted her family in Michigan, and no one there had seen her or knew anything about a visit. Raymond's story was already falling apart, but without a body, without physical evidence, there was nothing they could do except watch and wait. I started sleeping with a baseball bat next to my bed, something I had not done since college when I lived in a bad neighborhood. Every creak in the house made me sit up straight. Every car that drove past made me hold my breath. I found myself watching Raymond's house from my bedroom window, tracking when his lights went on and off, noting when his truck left and when it returned. On the 6th night, I woke up at 3 a.m. to a sound I could not immediately identify. A rhythmic scraping noise, metal against dirt, coming from somewhere outside. I crept to my window and looked toward Raymond's backyard, and in the faint glow of the moon I saw him behind the shed digging. I grabbed my phone and called 911 with trembling fingers, whispering into the receiver like he might somehow hear me from 3 houses away. I told them what I was seeing, told them about Allison, about the history Officer Holt had shared with me, about everything. They said they would send someone immediately and told me to stay inside and away from the windows. I did not listen. I stayed right there, watching Raymond work that shovel into the earth, his silhouette moving in steady, practiced motions like he had done this before. The hole grew deeper and wider, and at one point he disappeared into the shed and came back dragging something heavy, something wrapped in what looked like a blue tarp. My entire body went cold as I watched him roll it into the hole, and I had to press my hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound. Within 20 minutes, he was filling the hole back in, packing the dirt down with the flat of the shovel, working quickly but carefully. By the time the police lights appeared at the end of the street, Raymond was already spreading grass seed over the freshly leveled ground, covering his work like nothing had ever happened. The police detained Raymond that night and obtained a warrant to search his property the following morning. I watched from my porch as they brought in dogs and equipment, as they cordoned off the backyard with yellow tape, as they started digging in the exact spot I had pointed out. They found Allison buried 4 feet down, still wrapped in that blue tarp, her body showing signs of blunt force trauma to the head. Her phone was recovered from a kitchen drawer inside the house, wiped clean, but still containing her final text messages, including the one she sent me about wanting to talk. The investigation expanded quickly after that. They brought in ground-penetrating radar and found 2 more sets of remains on the property, one behind the garage and one under a concrete slab Raymond had poured for a fire pit 3 years earlier. Christine and Megan had never left Cedar Ridge. They had been there the whole time, buried in the backyard of that perfect house with its white furniture and spotless carpets, hidden beneath grass that Raymond had carefully maintained for years. He was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, and I had to testify at his trial about everything I had witnessed, everything Allison had shared with me, everything I should have seen sooner, but did not. I moved away from Cedar Ridge 6 months after the trial ended. I could not walk past that house anymore, could not look at the backyard without seeing Raymond's silhouette in the moonlight, without imagining Allison's body being lowered into the ground. Sometimes I still think about that last text she sent me, the one where she said she wanted to talk, and I wonder what would have happened if I had gone to her that night, instead of waiting until the next day. Maybe I could have helped her leave. Maybe I could have driven her somewhere safe before Raymond realized what she was planning. Or maybe he would have killed us both. That thought keeps me up some nights too. I keep in touch with Officer Holt, who retired last year but still sends me updates when there are developments in the case. Raymond is serving 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He never confessed, never showed remorse, never explained why he did what he did. Some nights I lie awake and remember Allison's smile, the brownies she brought me on my 3rd Saturday in town, the way her pale blue eyes looked when she asked me what it felt like to finally be free. I hope she found it wherever she is now. I hope all 3 of them did. Moving day fell on a Friday in late April, and I remember the azaleas were blooming all along Crescent Ridge Drive when the moving truck finally pulled up to my new place. My divorce had been finalized just 6 weeks earlier, right around my class reunion reminder that made me realize 15 years had passed since high school graduation. The house was a modest 3-bedroom ranch with pale blue siding and a detached garage, exactly the kind of fresh start I needed after splitting everything down the middle with my ex-husband. I had spent months searching for something within my budget as a veterinary technician, and this quiet suburb outside of Richmond, Virginia, seemed perfect. The neighborhood had that picture-perfect quality to it, with manicured lawns and American flags hanging from porches. I signed the lease without hesitation, already imagining myself drinking coffee on that little wooden deck out back. That Friday afternoon, as I directed the movers where to place my second-hand couch, I felt something I had not experienced in years: genuine hope. I had barely finished unpacking my kitchen boxes when I heard a knock at the side door. Standing on my small concrete porch was a woman who looked to be in her late 40s, holding a casserole dish covered in aluminum foil. She introduced herself as Jolene Whitmore, and she lived in the pale yellow house directly next door, the one with the white picket fence and the garden gnomes lined up like soldiers along the walkway. Her smile was wide and her handshake was firm, maybe a little too firm, and she immediately launched into what she called her welcome wagon routine. She told me about trash pickup schedules, the best grocery store in the area, which mechanic to trust, and which one to avoid. I appreciated the gesture, honestly. After months of feeling isolated during the divorce proceedings, having someone show genuine friendliness felt like a warm blanket. Jolene stayed for almost an hour that first evening, walking through my house and offering suggestions about where to put furniture, which rooms got the best morning light, and how the previous owners had struggled with the water pressure in the master bathroom. I thanked her for the casserole and watched her walk back to her property through the gap in our shared fence, thinking how lucky I was to have such a welcoming neighbor. The first week passed in a blur of unpacking and settling in. Jolene stopped by almost every day, sometimes with baked goods, sometimes just to chat. She always seemed to catch me at convenient moments, like she had a sixth sense for when I was taking a break or stepping outside for fresh air. On Wednesday, she brought over lemon bars and mentioned how nice it was that I had chosen the back bedroom as my sleeping space instead of the master. I remembered pausing mid-bite, wondering how she knew that, since I had not mentioned it and my bedroom curtains had been closed since I moved in. I brushed it off, figuring maybe she had seen me carrying my bed frame through the hallway window or something. Small towns, small suburbs, people notice things. That was what I told myself. She also commented on how smart I was to shower in the evenings instead of the mornings, saying it helped with the hot water situation in these older houses. I had not told her my shower schedule either. But again, I rationalized it away. Maybe she could hear the pipes through the walls, or maybe the previous tenant had the same routine, and she just assumed. By the second week, the comments became harder to ignore. Jolene appeared at my door on Saturday morning, right as I was finishing my coffee, and casually mentioned that I should really stop leaving my kitchen window cracked open for so long during the day. She said it was an invitation for bugs and, with a little laugh, other unwanted visitors. The thing is, I had only started doing that 3 days earlier because the kitchen got stuffy while I cooked, and I only left it open for about 2 hours each afternoon. There was no way she could see my kitchen window from her house because of the angle and the tall wooden fence between our properties. I stood there in my doorway, coffee mug growing cold in my hands, and asked her how she knew about the window. Jolene just smiled and said she had lived here for 12 years and knew everything about these houses, every quirk and every draft. Her eyes held mine for a second too long, and then she changed the subject to the upcoming neighborhood barbecue. That night, I made sure every window was locked and every curtain was drawn, but I could not shake the crawling sensation that I was being observed even in my own home. I started paying closer attention to everything after that. I noticed that Jolene always seemed to know when I had company, even though my friend Heather only visited once and parked in the garage where no one could see her car. The next morning, Jolene asked me if my friend had enjoyed the tour of the house and whether she thought the guest room was cozy enough. Heather and I had spent maybe 10 minutes in the guest room, flipping through old photo albums and laughing about our college days. I had not posted anything on social media, had not mentioned the visit to anyone. When I told Heather about it over the phone that evening, she got quiet and asked me if I had checked my house for anything strange. I laughed nervously and asked her what she meant. She said her cousin had dealt with a stalker once, and the guy had planted tiny cameras in her apartment, devices so small they looked like screws or buttons. I told her she was being paranoid, that Jolene was just an overly friendly woman with too much time on her hands. But after I hung up, I found myself walking slowly through each room, scanning the walls, the corners, the electrical outlets, looking for something I could not even describe. That Sunday afternoon, I decided to do a deep clean of the house, partly to calm my nerves and partly because I needed to feel in control of my own space again. I started in the living room, moving furniture and vacuuming behind the couch, when I noticed something odd near the baseboard closest to the wall I shared with Jolene's property. There was a small hole, perfectly round, maybe the diameter of a pencil eraser, drilled right through the wood at ankle height. At first I thought it was some kind of old cable outlet or pest damage, but when I got down on my knees and looked closer, I saw that the edges were clean and precise, not gnawed or weathered. I grabbed my phone flashlight and aimed it into the hole, but it was too deep to see anything. My heart started beating faster as I moved along the baseboard, and within a few feet I found another hole. Same size, same surgical precision. I followed the wall into the hallway and found 3 more, each one positioned low and angled slightly upward. By the time I reached my bedroom, my hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold the phone steady. In my bedroom, I found 2 more holes along the baseboard, both positioned with a direct line of sight to my bed. One was partially hidden behind my nightstand, and I never would have noticed it if I had not been specifically searching. I moved to the bathroom next, my stomach churning with a sickening dread that made me want to vomit. The air vent above the shower had always seemed slightly crooked to me, but I had assumed it was just old construction. Now I pulled a chair from the kitchen and stood on it to get a closer look. The vent cover came off easily, too easily, and behind it I found another hole drilled through the wall, this one larger than the others. But what made my breath catch in my throat was what I saw around the edges of the hole. 4 tiny screw marks in a perfect square pattern, and faint scratches in the drywall where something had recently been mounted and then removed. Someone had installed something there, something small enough to fit inside the vent and then taken it away. I thought about all those showers I had taken with the bathroom door open because I lived alone and valued the steam circulation. I thought about every private moment in that room, every inch of my body exposed, and I had to grip the chair to keep from collapsing. I called Heather first, barely able to form sentences, and she told me to get out of the house immediately and call the police. I grabbed my purse and my phone charger and drove to a parking lot 3 blocks away before dialing 911. The dispatcher asked me to describe the situation, and I realized how insane it sounded coming out of my mouth. My neighbor knows too much about me, and I found holes in my walls, but she took me seriously and sent 2 officers to meet me. We drove back to the house together, and I showed them everything I had found. One of the officers, a tall man with graying temples named Sergeant Briggs, got down on his knees and examined the holes with a small flashlight while his partner took photographs. He confirmed what I already feared. The holes were drilled from the other side, from inside the wall cavity that connected to Jolene's property. The screw marks in the bathroom vent were consistent with a mounting bracket for a small wireless camera. He said they had seen this before, that these devices were cheap and easy to buy online, and that whoever had installed them had probably removed them recently, maybe within the last few days. I thought about Jolene's comment about the kitchen window, and realized she might have known I was starting to get suspicious. The officers asked me to stay outside while they went next door to speak with Jolene. I sat in the back of the patrol car with the door open, watching the front of her pale yellow house with its cheerful garden gnomes and white picket fence. Everything about that house looked so normal, so wholesome, like something out of a home decorating magazine. Sergeant Briggs knocked on her door 3 times before she finally answered. And even from across the yard, I could see the surprise on her face, the quick flash of something darker before she arranged her features into a pleasant smile. They spoke for about 10 minutes on her porch, and then his partner walked around to the side of her house while Jolene gestured and shook her head with exaggerated confusion. When the officers returned to me, Sergeant Briggs explained that Jolene had denied everything and refused to allow them inside without a warrant. She claimed the holes must have been made by the previous owners and that she had no idea what I was talking about. But he also told me something that made my skin prickle with fresh horror. His partner had noticed that the section of fence between our properties had a small gate I had never seen before, hidden behind an overgrown hydrangea bush on Jolene's side. The gate was unlocked and showed signs of frequent use, with worn grass forming a path directly to my back door. The next 48 hours were a nightmare of paperwork, interviews, and sleepless nights at a motel off the interstate. The police obtained a warrant to search Jolene's home based on the physical evidence and her proximity to the drill points. What they found inside her house was beyond anything I could have imagined during my worst paranoid moments. In her basement, she had a small desk set up with 2 monitors and a laptop, all connected to a wireless receiver. There were folders on her computer organized by date, going back nearly 3 years, containing thousands of video files and photographs from that house. The previous tenant before me had been a young woman named Allison, who lived there for almost 2 years before moving out suddenly. Before Allison, there had been another woman named Grace who stayed for 8 months. The folders had their names on them, and mine was there too, labeled with my first and last name and the date I signed my lease. The officers told me that Jolene had been watching and recording every woman who lived in that house for at least 3 years, capturing their most intimate and vulnerable moments through a network of tiny cameras she installed and removed whenever a new tenant arrived or left. Jolene Whitmore was arrested and charged with multiple counts of unlawful surveillance, voyeurism, and invasion of privacy. During the investigation, detectives discovered that she had been selling some of the footage on underground websites, making thousands of dollars from the recorded lives of women who thought they were safe in their own homes. The prosecutor told me that Jolene showed no remorse during her interviews, and that she spoke about her victims with a chilling detachment, as if we were characters in a show she produced rather than real human beings. I had to testify at her trial 7 months later, sitting in that courtroom and looking at the woman who had smiled at me, while handing over casseroles, knowing she had watched me undress, shower, sleep, and cry during my lowest moments after the divorce. She never looked at me once during my testimony, just stared straight ahead with that same pleasant expression she wore on her porch. The jury convicted her on all counts, and she was sentenced to 12 years in state prison. I later learned that the previous tenants, Allison and Grace, had both been tracked down and notified. Allison told investigators she had moved out because she always felt watched but could never prove it, and that people made her feel crazy when she tried to explain. I broke my lease that same month and moved to a different state entirely, somewhere flat and open, where I could see for miles in every direction. It took me almost a year before I could shower without checking the vents first, before I could sleep without pushing furniture against the walls to cover any possible holes. I still have nightmares sometimes, dreams where I wake up and find Jolene sitting at the foot of my bed, smiling that wide, neighborly smile, and asking if I need any tips about the house. My therapist says the hypervigilance will fade with time, and maybe she is right. But I want everyone reading this to understand something important. Trust your instincts. If someone knows things about you they should not know, do not rationalize it away like I did. Do not tell yourself you are being paranoid, or that small-town people just notice things. Check your walls, check your vents, check the fence line between your property and theirs, because the person bringing you welcome casseroles and offering friendly advice might be the same person watching you through a pinhole camera when you think you are finally, completely alone. Mail has never been something I paid much attention to, but that changed during a stretch of time when I was working from home and keeping a pretty steady routine. My neighborhood is quiet in a way that feels almost staged. Same cars parked in the same driveways, same older folks walking their dogs at the same early hours, same jogger with a neon orange vest passing by right before noon. I'd lived there long enough to know the rhythm of the place, so when envelopes started showing up with names I didn't recognize, I figured it was just the usual mix-up from the mail carrier. The first ones were easy to dismiss: a gardening magazine, a coupon booklet addressed to someone a few streets over. Nothing weird, but I kept setting them aside on my entryway table, meaning to drop them off later, and the pile grew faster than I expected. The tone of the mail shifted about a week in. Instead of catalogs, I started getting envelopes with windows showing official-looking headers: law firms, payroll companies, hospital networks from around town. One arrived with a bold red urgent stamp that practically shouted at me the moment I picked it up. The names changed every day. Different families, different addresses, all within a few blocks of my house. Sometimes the envelopes listed full addresses I recognized from my walks around the neighborhood: yellow two-story with the cracked porch step, brick house with the silver mailbox, and the wind chime that never stops rattling. Every letter had a weight to it, even before I read a single word inside, like each envelope was carrying someone's private life sealed in paper. Curiosity pushed me to check with a couple of neighbors to return what I assumed was their missing mail. I walked over to a place belonging to a young couple who had recently repainted their shutters bright blue, thinking at least the magazine addressed to them would be a harmless conversation starter. When I handed it to the guy who answered the door, tall, wearing paint-splattered sweats, he frowned and told me they hadn't been missing anything. He even showed me a stack of bills and letters sitting right on their hall table, perfectly intact. His reaction wasn't annoyed or confused, just baffled, like I'd brought him something from a parallel version of his life. That threw me off enough to try another house, this one belonging to a woman named Trish, who I'd chatted with a few times when she watered her plants in the late afternoons. When I showed her the envelope with her name, she blinked at it as if it were some kind of optical illusion. She told me she never saw that bill, never expected it, and hadn't noticed anything strange with her mailbox. She even joked that if someone wanted to pay her medical expenses, they were welcome to it. The joke didn't land, mostly because both of us were aware of how strange it felt, just standing there with an envelope neither of us could explain. I walked home with the uneasy sense that I was holding pieces of everyone's life, except my own. By the time the fifth envelope arrived, this one a pay stub addressed to a guy who lived near the corner with the leaning street sign, I felt something shift in how I looked at each piece of paper. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was the awareness that every letter came from someone close, someone whose porch light I'd seen, whose dog I'd heard barking, whose trash cans I'd wheeled past on collection day. These weren't random strangers. These were people whose routines overlapped with mine every single day. And somehow, their mail was bypassing their own homes and landing neatly in my box, like I'd been selected for the privilege. The idea that it could all be mistakes felt thinner each time I unfolded another document with someone else's income, someone else's appointment reminders, someone else's court summons printed in stark black text. I decided to test a theory. Around mid-morning, when the neighborhood usually emptied out, cars gone, windows dark, driveways cleared, I sat in my living room, watching through the blinds. The mail carrier did his normal route, pacing with the same quick shuffle he always had, depositing envelopes without hesitation. He didn't slow down near my house, didn't look puzzled, didn't circle back. Everything about his routine felt identical to every other day I'd watched him pass. Yet when I opened my mailbox afterward, I found another letter addressed to a family 2 blocks east of me. Their house was one of the quiet ones during daylight hours. Both parents left early for work, and their teenage daughter usually wasn't home until after school. I knew that because I'd seen their driveway empty for years. Something about that coincidence stuck in my mind. I walked the route myself, from my house to theirs, taking mental notes like I was mapping the neighborhood in a new way. I noticed little details I'd never paid attention to. Which houses had curtains drawn all day, which ones had delivery boxes sitting untouched on porches, which driveways stayed empty from morning to dusk. The mailbox at the family's home was completely empty when I arrived, not even a stray flyer shoved inside. That meant the mail either hadn't been delivered at all, or had been intercepted before it reached the box. The stillness of the street felt unnaturally deep as I stood there, as if I had stepped into a snapshot of a neighborhood paused in time. When I finally turned to walk back, an older man further down the street waved me over. I didn't recognize him well, but I knew his house, the one with the metal rooster mounted above the garage. He asked if I lived nearby, and when I told him where, he let out a thoughtful hum and said he'd been missing a few bills recently. Not enough to panic over, but enough to make him wonder if the postal service had switched up something. When I mentioned the misplaced mail landing at my place, his expression tightened just a little. The way someone looks when something connects in their mind that they weren't prepared to say out loud. He didn't voice whatever thought rushed through him, but he did tell me one thing. His street stayed empty most weekdays, sometimes for hours at a time. That night, with the neighborhood settling into its usual patchwork of porch lights and quiet driveways, I laid out every envelope on my coffee table. Seeing them all together made something click that I'd been circling around without naming. Every letter belonged to a household that was consistently empty during work hours. None came from places where someone stayed home during the day. No retirees, no remote workers, no households with a stay-at-home parent. It looked less like a postal blunder and more like someone was tracking patterns, learning which houses stayed unoccupied for long stretches. The thought crept in slowly. Whoever was doing this didn't need the mail itself. They needed the information inside it, and they needed to know when no one would be around to stop them. I tried to shake it off as paranoia, but the next morning, while taking out the trash, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A thin strip of blue tape stuck to the underside of my own mailbox, positioned in a way that wasn't visible unless you bent down low. It wasn't old or weathered. The adhesive edges were clean, freshly pressed. A marker maybe, a sign. Made me wonder how many other mailboxes in the neighborhood had the same subtle tag placed where only someone searching for it would notice. I walked down the block pretending to check for cracks in the sidewalk, and as I passed a few houses, I spotted identical strips beneath two other boxes, both belonging to families who were gone from early morning to late afternoon. I didn't wait to see what the next envelope would bring. I called the non-emergency police line and explained everything, from the redirected mail to the taped mailboxes. The officer who came out was a younger guy with a calm way of talking, the type who stayed patient even when he was trying to piece together a messy puzzle. He checked the boxes himself, took down notes, photographed the envelopes, and told me this wasn't the first complaint like it in our general area. He didn't say much beyond that, but his tone carried a kind of careful weight, like he didn't want to confirm anything until he had backup. He left me with instructions to keep any new mail that wasn't mine and to avoid removing any more tape if I found it. A couple of days later, the strange deliveries stopped completely. Not one misplaced envelope, not one unfamiliar name. The tape on my mailbox disappeared overnight without a trace, and the others down the street were gone too. I never got an update from the officer, and no one in the neighborhood brought it up again. Life slid back into its usual rhythm. But every time I walk past a house with an empty driveway, or see a package sitting untouched on a porch, I think about how close someone came to using all of us as their personal blueprint. Whoever planned it backed off, moved on, or changed tactics. I never found out which. All I know is that for a short stretch of time, my mailbox became a doorway into a map someone else was drawing, one quiet household at a time. Nothing unusual was happening in my life when my neighbor asked if I could stay at her place for a few days while she traveled. I'd been working remotely, juggling a quiet routine, and her house was only a few doors away from mine, so it sounded like a simple favor. Her place always felt a little too still, like the walls held on to silence longer than they should, but I didn't think much of it. The first night there, I remember noticing how the second-floor window faced directly toward the street, angled in a way that caught every passing car's headlights. I didn't bother going upstairs, figuring I'd sleep on the main floor and keep things simple. The following morning, around breakfast time, my phone buzzed with a message from a delivery driver. He asked if someone new had moved into the house recently. The question felt random enough that I assumed he'd mixed up addresses, so I replied, letting him know I was just house-sitting. His response came fast, too fast, asking if the woman he saw in the window the night before was gone now. That line jolted me. I told him no one else was supposed to be inside with me, and he apologized in this hesitant way, like he wasn't sure whether to push the subject or leave it alone. I tried shaking it off, telling myself he must have seen a reflection or a shadow. By mid-afternoon, another driver reached out with almost the same question. This one said he'd dropped off a small package late the previous night and saw someone standing behind the upstairs curtains, unmoving, like they were watching the street. He asked if I wanted him to report suspicious activity. That offer sent a slow, crawling tension through my chest. I thanked him, said I'd look into it, and then stood in the foyer staring up at the second floor I hadn't even stepped into yet. The house felt different now, still quiet but in a tighter way, like the silence had thickened. I eventually made myself go upstairs. The carpet had that faint, dusty smell older houses get when windows stay shut too long. I checked the room facing the street first. Everything was exactly how my neighbor had left it. Bed nicely made, no footprints in the thin layer of dust on the floor, and the curtains half drawn in a stiff, untouched way. Nothing looked like it had been disturbed. Still, something about the room felt recently used. Not physically, but observed. I closed the door gently, walked back downstairs, and tried to move on with my day, even though a strange unease kept tugging at me. The second night was worse. I kept catching myself glancing toward the staircase like I was expecting to see movement at the top landing, even though that made no sense. I stayed downstairs again, lights low, trying to focus on a show. But every time a car passed outside, the faint sweep of headlights would skim across the living room wall and remind me of what those drivers said. Around midnight, I walked to the front window and looked up at the upstairs room. The curtains were still closed the way I'd left them, undisturbed. But the longer I stared, the more I had that creeping sense that someone else might be staring back through that narrow gap where the fabric didn't fully meet. I barely slept. When the sun came up, I went outside to get some air, and something subtle caught my attention. The curtains upstairs weren't where I'd left them. They weren't dramatically pulled back or anything like that, but shifted by just an inch or two, just enough to make a difference. I stood on the walkway trying to convince myself that I simply hadn't paid attention the day before, but I knew the angle had changed. The window was positioned so precisely that even the smallest adjustment altered the view from the street. It felt like someone had been watching the world outside and stepped away before the light returned. That discovery pushed me to check the room again. I climbed the stairs slower this time, listening for any sign that another person might be moving around up there. The door was still shut the way I'd left it. When I opened it, everything appeared untouched. The dust on the dresser looked the same, the bedspread still crisp. The curtains, though, up close, they didn't seem different at all. No wrinkles, no marks, no sign someone had pulled them. I stood there for a long time, longer than I meant to, trying to pick out anything out of place. Nothing moved, but the air felt charged, like the room held a memory I wasn't allowed to see. Before leaving the room, I crouched near the floor to double-check for footprints, scuffs, anything that could confirm what the drivers kept claiming. Still nothing. When I straightened up, I caught a faint scent I hadn't noticed before. Something like old fabric that had been exposed to nighttime air, the kind of smell curtains get when someone parts them repeatedly. It wasn't strong, but it didn't match the sealed-up stillness the house had carried since I arrived. I backed out of the room, shut the door softly, and tried to talk myself into believing I was making connections that weren't really there. That evening, I decided to stay awake longer just to see if anything happened. I kept the lights dim and positioned myself on the couch where I had a partial view of the upstairs window through the front curtains. Hours passed without anything unusual, but I couldn't shake the restless feeling that the house wasn't as empty as it looked. Sometime after midnight, while everything outside was still, I heard a soft sound from upstairs, almost like fabric brushing against itself. It wasn't loud, but it carried enough weight to make the hairs along my neck lift. I stared at the staircase, waiting for another sign, but nothing followed. Eventually, curiosity won over discomfort, and I took a slow step toward the stairs. As I reached the top, The hallway felt colder than before, not freezing, just touched by something that didn't belong to the rest of the house. The door to the street-facing room was open, which stopped me in my tracks. I was positive I'd closed it earlier. From where I stood, I could see the curtains shifting slightly, as if someone had just stepped away from the window. I walked in carefully, keeping my breath steady. The room was empty, completely empty. But the curtains were swaying in a way that didn't match the still air. It reminded me of the way someone leaves behind a subtle disturbance right after moving from a spot. I closed the curtains firmly, pulled them into place, and latched the window just to be safe. Then I shut the door, making sure I pressed it until the frame clicked. I went back downstairs and paced for a long time, debating whether I should just leave and sleep at my own place. But I didn't want to abandon my neighbor's house or make her worry. So I stayed. When morning finally came, I walked outside and looked back up at the window with that lingering dread still tugging at me. And there it was again. The curtains parted just enough to form a narrow viewing line toward the street, as if someone had spent the night standing exactly where those drivers swore they saw a figure. That was the moment I stopped second-guessing myself. I locked the house up, texted my neighbor to let her know I needed to step out for a bit, and returned only during daylight for the rest of her trip. Nothing else happened after that. The curtains stayed exactly where I left them each night, untouched, but whatever had been standing in that window kept its distance once I refused to stay there after dark. Even now, I still can't explain who or what those drivers saw. All I know is that something in that house preferred the nighttime, and I wasn't about to share it with them again. Every year, my friends drag me to some New Year's Eve event, and every year I swear it will be the last time. But 2023 felt different. I had just gone through a rough breakup, spent most of December alone in my apartment, and Megan practically showed up at my door to physically pull me out of my isolation. Our little group of 4 had been inseparable since college. Me, Megan, her boyfriend Troy, and my coworker Dennis, who joined our circle after we started working together at a marketing firm downtown. We had all graduated back in 2015, which meant we were hitting that strange phase where half our friends were having babies, and the other half still could not commit to a city. That night, we took a rideshare to the waterfront to watch the fireworks, grabbed some tacos from a food truck, and planned to catch another ride home before surge pricing made the trip cost more than our entire evening out. Everything went smoothly until around 2:30 in the morning, when we were already on our way back. The ride home was through Uber Share, one of those shared ride apps where you split the fare with strangers heading in the same direction. Our driver was a quiet guy named Oscar, who had a small Colombian flag hanging from his rearview mirror, and played soft reggaeton at a volume that felt respectful for the late hour. There were 2 other passengers already in the minivan when we climbed in, a young couple who looked like they had partied way harder than us. The girl already half asleep against the window with glitter smeared across her cheek. The route took us through the northern suburbs, and by the time we hit the residential streets past Oakwood Heights, everything was dead silent. Most people were either still celebrating downtown or passed out at home. The houses looked eerie in the darkness, deflated inflatable snowmen lying flat on frozen lawns, string lights blinking on timers with nobody awake to notice them. Oscar was taking a shortcut through a neighborhood I did not recognize when we stopped at a red light at a 4-way intersection. And that is when everything changed. A dark blue sedan was stopped in the lane next to us, slightly ahead so we could see directly into the driver's side window. At first, I thought the 2 people inside were just having an argument, the kind of loud, messy fight that couples have after drinking too much on a holiday. But then the driver's arm came up, and I saw his fist connect with the woman's face. Not a slap, not a shove, a full closed fist punch that snapped her head against the passenger window. Megan gasped beside me, and Troy leaned forward between the front seats to get a better look. The driver hit her again, this time grabbing a fistful of her hair and slamming her head against the dashboard. The woman was not fighting back. She was not even trying to protect herself. Her arms hung limp at her sides like she had already given up, like this was not the first time. I could see blood on her face now, dark and shiny under the streetlight, smearing across the window where her cheek pressed against the glass. Oscar muttered something in Spanish and looked at us through the rearview mirror, his eyes wide with the same disbelief we all felt. Troy did not hesitate. He reached over and slammed his palm against the horn, holding it down for a solid 5 seconds. The sound cut through the silent neighborhood like a scream, and the man in the sedan stopped mid-swing. His head turned slowly toward our minivan, and I got my first clear look at his face. He was maybe in his 40s, with a thick neck and a shaved head that gleamed under the amber streetlight. His eyes were not wild or crazy like I expected. They were cold, calculated, like he was sizing us up and deciding what to do about the interruption. The light turned green, but nobody moved. For a long, horrible moment, we just stared at each other through the glass. Then his lips curled into something that was not quite a smile, and he raised one finger, pointing directly at our windshield, directly at us, before slowly pulling his car forward and turning right. Dennis already had his phone out, dialing 911 before the sedan even completed the turn. Oscar hit the gas the moment the other car was out of sight, and I felt the minivan lurch forward as we sped through the intersection going straight, putting as much distance as possible between us and whatever we had just witnessed. The young couple in the back row had woken up now, the girl asking in a confused, slurred voice what was happening. Nobody answered her. I was twisted around in my seat, watching the road behind us through the rear window, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. For about 30 seconds I thought we were clear. The street behind us stayed empty, just dark asphalt and parked cars and the occasional porch light. Then a pair of headlights swung around the corner. Fast, way too fast. And I knew immediately it was him. He had circled the block. He had come back for us. Dennis was still on hold with 911, the automated message repeating something about high call volume due to the holiday, and I wanted to scream at the recording that someone was about to die tonight if they did not pick up. Oscar was driving faster now, weaving through the residential streets with a focus that told me this was not his first time in a bad situation. The sedan stayed about 50 feet behind us, matching our speed exactly, never falling back and never getting closer. It was like he wanted us to know he was there, wanted us to feel him right on our tail. Troy was trying to get a photo of the license plate through the back window, but between the darkness and the motion, everything came out blurred. Megan had her arm around me, squeezing tight, and I realized I was shaking, not from cold, but from pure adrenaline flooding every part of my body. The streets were completely empty, every house dark, everyone asleep, or passed out from celebrating. We passed a stop sign without even slowing down, and the sedan did the same. Then another. Oscar made a sharp left turn without signaling, tires squealing against the pavement, and for a moment I thought we had lost him. But when I looked back, those headlights were already rounding the corner behind us, steady and patient, like a predator who knew his prey had nowhere to go. The sedan surged forward without warning, closing the gap between us in seconds. I heard Megan scream as the headlights flooded our back window, so bright I had to shield my eyes. He was right on our bumper now, close enough that I could make out his silhouette through the glare. That thick neck, that bald head, one hand on the wheel and the other doing something I could not see. Oscar swerved hard to the right, and the sedan clipped our back corner with a crunch of metal that sent us fishtailing across the empty street. The young couple in the back was fully awake now, the guy yelling questions that nobody had time to answer. I grabbed the headrest in front of me and held on as Oscar regained control, my teeth rattling from the impact. The sedan had fallen back a few car lengths, but I could see a fresh dent in his front bumper gleaming under a streetlight. And I could see him laughing. Actually laughing, his mouth wide open, shoulders shaking with amusement like this was the most fun he had experienced in years. That image burned itself into my memory. A man who beats women in his car, who chases strangers through empty streets at 3 a.m, laughing like he was watching a comedy show. Finally, a voice came through Dennis's phone. A real human voice, tired and stressed but real. He started talking fast, giving our location as best he could, describing the sedan, the assault we witnessed, the chase that was now entering its 5th minute. The dispatcher told us to stay on the line, to keep moving, that units were being sent, but response times were delayed because of the holiday. Delayed. That word hit me like a punch to the chest. We were being hunted through a sleeping neighborhood, and help was delayed. Oscar shouted that he was heading toward the main road, hoping there would be more traffic, more witnesses, maybe even a police car doing a routine patrol. But the residential street seemed endless. Block after block of identical houses with their porch lights off and their curtains drawn. The sedan rammed us again, harder this time, and I heard something crack underneath the minivan, a sound that made Oscar curse loudly in Spanish. Troy was trying to calm everyone down, telling us we just needed to make it to Bleecker Avenue, where there would be gas stations and a 24-hour diner, but his voice was trembling so badly that the words came out in pieces. We almost made it. I could see the glow of commercial lights ahead, the familiar red and yellow of a gas station sign rising above the rooftops like a beacon. Oscar pushed the minivan as hard as it would go, the engine whining in protest, and for a few beautiful seconds the sedan fell behind. But then came a sound that made my stomach turn, a rhythmic thumping from somewhere beneath us, getting louder with each rotation of the wheels. The first impact had done more damage than we realized. Oscar was losing control, the steering pulling hard to the left no matter how much he fought it. We limped through one more intersection before he had no choice but to pull over, the minivan shuddering to a stop against the curb in front of a dark house with a for sale sign in the yard. The gas station was maybe 3 blocks away. It might as well have been 3 miles. The sedan rolled up behind us and stopped, its headlights illuminating the interior of our vehicle like a stage. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. We sat there in that harsh white light, waiting to see what he would do next. The driver's door of the sedan swung open, and he stepped out onto the street. He was bigger than I expected. Not just the thick neck I had noticed before, but broad shoulders and arms that strained against a dark jacket. He walked toward us slowly, deliberately, his boots making a sound against the asphalt that seemed impossibly loud in the silent neighborhood. Dennis was still on the phone with 911, whispering our new location, begging them to hurry. Oscar reached under his seat and pulled out a tire iron, his jaw set tight, and Troy grabbed the back of his seat like he was ready to jump out and help if it came to that. The man stopped about 10 feet from our rear bumper and just stood there, staring at us through the back window. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and I felt every muscle in my body tense so hard that my vision started to blur at the edges. But he did not pull out a weapon. He pulled out a cigarette and a lighter, lit it casually, and took a long drag while watching us like we were animals in a cage. He wanted us to know that he was in control, that he could take his time, that nobody was coming to save us. The standoff lasted maybe 2 minutes, but it felt like an hour. He finished his cigarette slowly, flicking the butt onto the pavement and grinding it under his boot. Then he started walking toward us again, and this time Oscar threw open his door and stepped out, the tire iron gripped tight in his right hand. I wanted to scream at him to get back inside, but my voice was stuck somewhere deep in my chest. The 2 men faced each other across the empty street, and I could see the calculation happening behind the aggressor's eyes, weighing whether this was worth it, measuring Oscar up, deciding if he could take him. That is when we heard it. Sirens. Faint at first, but getting louder, coming from somewhere to the east. The man heard them too, and something shifted in his posture. He took 1 step back, then another. His eyes swept across our minivan one final time, locking onto each of us through the windows like he was memorizing our faces. Then he pointed at us again, that same slow, deliberate gesture from the intersection, and walked back to his sedan. He got in, reversed smoothly, and disappeared down a side street just as the first red and blue lights appeared in the distance. By the time the patrol car reached us, he was gone. The cops took our statements for almost an hour, parked there on that dark residential street while the sky slowly turned gray with the first hint of dawn. They found the woman from the sedan at a hospital emergency room about 40 minutes later. She had walked in alone, bleeding from a gash above her eyebrow, and refused to say who hurt her. She would not press charges, would not even confirm that she knew the man we described. The police told us this happens more often than people think. that victims protect their abusers for reasons that are complicated and heartbreaking, and that without her cooperation, there was not much they could do. They never caught him. I spent weeks checking news sites, waiting for a story about a bald man with a thick neck arrested for assault or worse, but it never came. Sometimes I still think about that woman, wonder if she got away from him eventually, or if she is still trapped in that car, flinching every time his hand moves. And I think about the way he looked at us through that back window, smoking his cigarette, so patient and calm. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew he would get away with it. The thing that haunts me most is not the chase or the fear. It is the fact that somewhere out there, he is still driving those same streets, and the next person who honks at a red light might not have sirens coming to save them. My buddy Nathan texted me on December 28th, asking if the crew was still doing downtown Portland for New Year's Eve. We had kept this tradition alive since graduating together in 2015, and no matter how crazy life got, that one night stayed sacred. So on December 31st of 2024, 6 of us headed to Pioneer Courthouse Square for the big countdown. Nathan brought his girlfriend, Brooke. Our friend Theo came with his brother Julian, and I invited Priscilla from my office, who had just moved to Oregon and never experienced the madness of a proper downtown celebration. The energy was electric from the moment we stepped off the MAX train around 10. Thousands of people packed into the square, breath visible in the cold air, everyone buzzing with that particular excitement that only exists in the final hours of a dying year. We found a decent spot near one of the food vendors, close enough to see the stage where a local band was playing covers of classic rock songs that got swallowed by crowd noise. By 11:30, the crowd had tripled. What started as a comfortable gathering transformed into a crushing mass of bodies pressed together so tight, I could feel strangers breathing against my neck. People kept pushing forward toward the stage, and our little group got separated despite our best efforts to hold on to each other. I lost sight of Nathan first, then Theo and Julian vanished somewhere to my left when a wave of people surged past. Priscilla grabbed my arm and shouted something I could not hear over the noise, but within seconds she got pulled away too, her hand slipping from mine like water through fingers. My phone had died an hour earlier because I forgot to charge it before leaving home, which meant I had no way to text anyone or check our meeting spot. The air grew thick and warm despite the freezing December temperature, a strange mix of body heat and alcohol breath and perfume that made my head swim. I needed to get out just for a minute, just enough space to breathe and think and figure out where everyone went. I pushed sideways through the crowd, using my shoulders to carve a path toward the edge of the square. It took almost 10 minutes to move 50 feet, squeezing between couples holding champagne bottles and groups of college kids wearing glittery hats and blowing noisemakers directly into my ears. When I finally broke free from the densest part of the gathering, I found myself near the corner of Southwest Yam Hill and 6th Avenue, where the crowd thinned enough that I could actually extend my arms without touching another person. A small side alley opened up between 2 older brick buildings, one of them a closed antique shop with iron bars over the windows. I stepped into the mouth of that alley just to catch my breath, leaning against the cold brick wall and letting the winter air fill my lungs. The noise from the square still thundered behind me, but here it felt muffled, distant, like listening to a concert from outside the venue. I checked my watch and saw 11:47 glowing in the dim light. 13 minutes until midnight, and I had no idea where my friends were. That was when the first firework exploded overhead. Someone had jumped the gun on the countdown, sending a burst of red and gold across the sky that lit up the alley in flickering colors. In that brief flash of light, I saw them. About 40 feet deeper into the alley, 2 men in dark jackets were dragging a woman toward a service door at the back of one of the buildings. She was struggling, her legs kicking against the pavement, one of her heels scraping the concrete as they pulled her. I saw her mouth open wide, saw her body twist and fight, but the boom of the fireworks swallowed whatever sound she made. For a second, I just stood there, my brain trying to process what my eyes were showing me. Another firework went up, this one green and white, and in its glow I saw her face clearly. Young, maybe mid-20s, mascara streaking down her cheeks, pure terror in her eyes. One of the men had his hand clamped over her mouth while the other gripped her arm so hard I could see the fabric of her silver dress bunching under his fingers. I did not think. I just moved. My feet carried me deeper into the alley before my brain could calculate the danger, and I heard myself yelling something like, "Hey, stop," or "Let her go." I cannot remember the exact words because my heart was pounding so loud it drowned out my own voice. The two men stopped and turned toward me. The fireworks kept exploding above us, painting their faces in bursts of color that made them look almost unreal. The one holding her mouth was shorter, stocky, with a shaved head and a neck thick as a tree trunk. The other was taller and leaner, wearing a black beanie pulled low over his forehead. They did not look panicked or surprised. They looked annoyed, like I was a fly buzzing around their dinner. The tall one said something to his partner in a language I did not recognize, then let go of the woman's arm and started walking toward me. His steps were slow and deliberate, almost casual, and that calmness scared me more than if he had charged. He stopped about 6 feet away from me and tilted his head to one side like he was studying an insect. He spoke in accented English, his voice low enough that I had to strain to hear it over the distant roar of the crowd and the ongoing firework bursts. "Wrong place, friend. Turn around. Go back to your party." His hand moved to his jacket pocket, and he pulled the zipper down just enough to show me what was inside. The blade caught a flash of blue light from a firework overhead. A folding knife, already open, the edge gleaming. He did not pull it out or wave it around. He just let me see it, let me understand what would happen if I stayed. Behind him, the stocky one still had the woman pinned, his hand tight over her face, and I could see her eyes fixed on me, wide and desperate, begging me not to leave. My mind raced through options like a slot machine spinning too fast to read. I could run back to the square, try to find a cop, but the police barricades had been set up around the main stage area, and I had seen officers redirecting people away from the side streets to manage the crowd flow. By the time I found someone and explained what was happening and led them back here, these men would be gone. The woman would be gone. The tall man took another step toward me, close enough now that I could smell cigarette smoke on his jacket. "Last chance," he said, and something in his tone told me he meant it. Behind us, the crowd in the square started the countdown. 10, 9, 8, their voices rising in unison like a distant wave. I looked past him at the woman, at the tears streaming down her face, at her fingers clawing uselessly at the stocky man's arm. 7, 6, 5. I thought about my dad, who passed away when I was 19, and how he always said that a man is defined by what he does when no one is watching. 4, 3, 2. The tall man smirked and started to turn back toward his partner, assuming I had made my choice. 1. The sky erupted in a symphony of explosions, a cascade of color and thunder that shook the windows of the buildings around us. And in that moment, while the tall man's attention flickered upward for just a fraction of a second, I grabbed a metal trash can lid leaning against the wall and swung it at his head with everything I had. The lid connected with the side of his skull with a sound I will never forget. A hollow, wet thunk that vibrated up through my arms and into my shoulders. He stumbled sideways, crashing into a stack of wooden pallets, and the knife clattered out of his hand onto the pavement. I did not stop to see if he was getting up. I ran past him toward the stocky one, who had released the woman's mouth to reach for something in his own pocket. She screamed then, a raw and broken sound that cut through even the roar of the fireworks, and threw her elbow backward into his ribs. He grunted and loosened his grip just enough for her to twist free. She fell to her knees on the concrete, scrambling toward me on all fours, her silver dress torn at the hem and her hair wild around her face. I grabbed her arm and pulled her up, already turning back toward the mouth of the alley. But the tall man was on his feet again, blood running down the side of his face, and he had retrieved his knife. He stood between us and the way out, his expression no longer annoyed but something much worse. Focused, predatory, like a hunter who had just decided his prey was worth the effort. The woman clutched my arm so hard her nails dug through my jacket sleeve. "There's another way," she gasped, her voice hoarse from screaming. "I saw it when they brought me in. A gate at the back leads to the next street." I did not have time to question her. The stocky man had recovered from the elbow to his ribs and was moving toward us now, flanking his partner, trapping us in a pincer. I turned and ran deeper into the alley, pulling the woman with me, our footsteps echoing off the brick walls. The fireworks were still going, burst after burst, lighting up the narrow passage in strobing flashes of red and gold and green. We passed dumpsters overflowing with cardboard boxes, a rusted bicycle chained to a pipe, puddles of something dark I did not want to identify. The alley twisted left, then right, opening into a small courtyard surrounded by the back entrances of closed businesses. A chain-link gate stood at the far end, maybe 7 feet tall, topped with barbed wire that glinted in the intermittent light. The woman pointed at it, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "There, we can climb it." I heard footsteps behind us getting closer, and the sound of the tall man cursing in that language I could not place. I reached the gate first and grabbed the chain link with both hands, testing its strength. It rattled, but held firm. I turned to the woman and cupped my hands together, creating a step for her foot. "Go, I'll boost you over." She hesitated for just a second, looking at me with an expression I could not read. Gratitude, maybe, or disbelief that a stranger would do this for her. Then she put her foot in my hands, and I lifted her up, my arms screaming from the effort as she grabbed the top of the fence and hauled herself over. She cleared the barbed wire somehow, leaving a strip of silver fabric caught on one of the points, and dropped down to the other side with a grunt of pain. I started climbing after her, my fingers hooking through the diamond-shaped gaps in the chain link, my shoes slipping on the metal. I was halfway up when a hand grabbed my ankle and yanked me backward. I lost my grip and fell, landing hard on my back in the courtyard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. The tall man stood over me, knife in hand, blood still dripping from his temple where I had hit him. His partner was right behind him, blocking any chance of escape back the way we came. The tall man crouched down beside me, pressing the flat of the blade against my cheek. I could feel how cold it was, how sharp the edge, and I thought about how strange it was that this might be the last thing I ever felt. "You should have walked away," he said, almost sadly, like he regretted what he was about to do. The fireworks had slowed down now, the grand finale fading into scattered pops and crackles, and I could hear the distant cheering of the crowd celebrating the new year. I was going to die in this dirty courtyard while thousands of people toasted champagne less than 2 blocks away. The stocky man said something to his partner, gesturing impatiently toward the gate where the woman had escaped. They were arguing, I realized. The stocky one wanted to go after her, finish what they started. The tall one seemed more interested in punishing me for interfering. Their disagreement bought me a few seconds, and I used them to scan the ground around me for anything I could use. My hand found a chunk of broken concrete near the base of the wall, about the size of a baseball, with jagged edges that bit into my palm. I did not have a plan. I just knew I was not going to lie there and let them decide my fate. I swung the concrete chunk upward with everything I had left, catching the tall man in the jaw. I heard teeth crack, heard him howl in pain, and then I was on my feet and running. Not toward the gate, but back into the maze of alleys, hoping to lose them in the darkness. My lungs burned and my back throbbed where I had fallen, but I kept moving, turning corners at random, knocking over trash cans behind me to slow them down. I burst out of an alley onto Southwest Stark Street and nearly collided with a group of drunk partygoers stumbling toward their ride. "Call 911, I shouted at them, not stopping to explain, and then I saw something beautiful. 2 police officers on bicycles, stationed at the corner to manage pedestrian overflow from the main event. I ran toward them, waving my arms, screaming about the woman and the men and the knife. They must have thought I was crazy at first, some drunk guy having a breakdown, but something in my face convinced them to take me seriously. One of them radioed for backup while the other followed me back toward the courtyard, and by the time we got there, the 2 men were gone, vanished into the night like they had never existed at all. The police found the woman 2 blocks away, sitting on the curb outside a late-night diner, shaking and crying but alive. Her name was Valerie, and she told the officers that the men had grabbed her outside a bar on Southwest Alder Street while she was waiting for her Uber. She had been at a party with co-workers, stepped out alone to get her ride, and within seconds they had her. She did not know them, had never seen them before, had no idea why they targeted her. The detective who took my statement said it was likely a random abduction, possibly connected to a trafficking operation they had been investigating for months. They never caught the two men. The security cameras in that part of downtown were either broken or pointed in the wrong direction, and the descriptions I gave, stocky bald guy, tall guy with a beanie, matched about 1,000 people in Portland that night. Valerie reached out to me through the detective a few weeks later, wanting to thank me in person. We met at a coffee shop in the Pearl District, and she brought me a gift card and a handwritten note that I still keep in my desk drawer. She told me she had nightmares every night, that she could not walk down the street alone anymore, that she had moved back in with her parents in Beaverton because she could not stand being in her apartment by herself. I did not know what to say. I just told her I was glad she was okay, and I meant it. Nathan and the others had spent 3 hours looking for me that night before I finally tracked them down at the police station where I was giving my statement. Priscilla cried when she saw me. Julian kept saying "dude" over and over like his brain had short-circuited. Brooke made me promise to never do anything that stupid again, and I lied and said I would not. The truth is, I do not know what I would do if I saw something like that again. I hope I would be brave. I hope I would act. But I also know now what it feels like to have a knife pressed against your face, to feel completely certain that you are about to die, and that knowledge changes you in ways you cannot explain. It has been almost a year now. I still go downtown sometimes, still walk past that alley on Southwest Yamhill. The antique shop is a smoothie place now. The courtyard got cleaned up and turned into a small parking lot. There is no sign that anything ever happened there. No memorial, no marker. Just concrete and brick and the ordinary flow of people going about their lives. But every time I pass it, I think about Valerie. I think about those two men, still out there somewhere. And I think about what my dad said, that a man is defined by what he does when no one is watching. On New Year's Eve of 2024, in a dark alley while the whole city looked up at the sky, I found out what kind of man I am. I just wish the answer did not still keep me awake at night. Kayla had been begging me to come to her neighborhood party for weeks. My younger sister moved to a cul-de-sac in suburban Phoenix right after her wedding in 2022, and this was her first time hosting anything bigger than a dinner. New Year's Eve seemed like the perfect occasion, she kept saying, and her neighbor Vic had promised to handle the fireworks. I remember rolling my eyes when she mentioned that part during our phone call. Fireworks in a residential area always made me nervous, but she assured me Vic knew what he was doing. He had connections, she said, worked for some company that did pyrotechnics for events. At 34, I should have trusted my gut more than my little sister's enthusiasm. But she sounded so excited, and I had spent the last 3 New Year's celebrations alone in my apartment with cheap champagne and whatever was streaming. So I drove the 2 hours from Tucson, arriving just as the sun was setting behind the stucco houses and dyeing the whole street this gorgeous shade of burnt orange. The backyard was smaller than I expected, maybe 40 feet deep before it hit a wooden fence that separated my sister's property from the house behind her. Vic had set up his equipment near that fence, which struck me as odd even before I understood what I was looking at. There were these metal racks, almost like ladder frames holding thick cardboard tubes pointed at the sky. A folding table next to them was covered with boxes I could not read from across the yard. Around 30 people milled around on the patchy grass, holding plastic cups and paper plates loaded with appetizers. Tiki torches lined the perimeter, their flames dancing in the slight breeze. My sister ran over the moment she spotted me, wrapping me in a hug that smelled like her vanilla perfume, and the sangria she was clearly already enjoying. She introduced me to a blur of faces I immediately forgot. Neighbors and co-workers and friends of friends, everyone in that buzzing pre-midnight mood where strangers become temporary best friends. I grabbed a drink and tried to relax, but my eyes kept drifting back to those tubes near the fence, counting them. There had to be at least 20. Around 11, Vic started gathering everyone closer to watch him prep the show. He was a stocky guy in his 50s with a gray goatee and a baseball cap that said something about veteran pyrotechnicians. His hands moved with confidence as he checked connections and adjusted angles, and I noticed he was wearing thick leather gloves. That detail should have reassured me, but it did the opposite. If he needed protection, what about the rest of us standing 15 feet away with nothing but flip cups in our hands? I mentioned this to a woman next to me, a redhead named Donna, who lived 3 houses down. She laughed and said Vic did this every year, that he was a total pro. Her 8-year-old son was sitting cross-legged on the grass near the front of the crowd, his face lit up with anticipation. I wanted to suggest she pull him back a bit, but I did not want to be that person, the paranoid guest ruining everyone's fun. So I stayed quiet, sipping my drink, watching Vic move between the racks like a surgeon preparing his instruments. The countdown started at 5 minutes to midnight. Someone had connected a phone to a portable speaker, and we could hear the broadcast from Times Square mixing with the neighborhood noise, other parties on adjacent streets, distant pops and crackles from early fireworks, dogs barking in protest. Kayla found me in the crowd and grabbed my arm, her eyes glassy from the sangria, but her smile so genuine it made me feel guilty for being anxious. She said this was going to be amazing, that Vic had spent over $2,000 on this display. I remember thinking that was insane, that amount of money on something that would last maybe 10 minutes, but then everyone started counting down from 30, and I got swept up in it despite myself. The voices around me grew louder, 20, 15, 10. Vic stood by his setup with a long lighter in his hand, waiting. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The cheering erupted, people hugged and kissed, and Vic touched the flame to the first fuse. The first few shots were beautiful, I will give him that. Golden bursts that spread across the sky like dandelion seeds caught in a wind, followed by crackling red ones that sounded like 1,000 tiny whips snapping at once. Everyone tilted their heads back, mouths open, the colors reflecting in their eyes. I felt myself relaxing a little, thinking maybe I had been ridiculous to worry. Vic moved along the rack with practiced ease, lighting fuses in sequence, stepping back to admire his work before moving to the next. The show was synchronized in a way that felt almost musical, the explosions building on each other in rhythm. I pulled out my phone to record a clip for my social media, something I rarely did, but the display was genuinely impressive. Then came a deeper boom, one of those big mortars that shake your chest from the inside. A purple flower bloomed overhead, and everyone gasped and applauded. Vic raised his fist in triumph. That was when I noticed the rack on the far left had started to tilt. It happened so fast that my brain almost refused to process it. The metal frame leaned maybe 5 degrees, then 10, and before anyone could react, one of the tubes fired. Not up, but sideways, almost parallel to the ground. The mortar shot across the yard like a flaming comet, trailing sparks and smoke, and slammed into the wooden fence about 3 feet to my right. The explosion was nothing like the ones in the sky. This was concentrated, violent, a punch of light and heat that sprayed splinters in every direction. Someone screamed, a sound that cut through the ringing in my ears. I stumbled backward and collided with a man I did not know, both of us nearly falling onto a knocked-over lawn chair. When I looked up, the rack had tilted further, and I could see the next tube in line, its fuse already burning down. It was pointing directly at the crowd. I do not remember making the decision to scream. The sound just ripped out of me, raw and primal. A single word repeated over and over. Move, move, move. People were already stumbling in different directions, but most of them had no idea what was happening. The sky was still exploding with color from the other racks that had not fallen, and the noise was so overwhelming that my warning barely carried. I grabbed the arm of the person closest to me, an older man with a white beard who looked completely disoriented, and yanked him toward the sliding glass door that led into the house. The second mortar fired just as we moved. I heard it more than saw it, a whooshing hiss followed by an impact somewhere behind us. Glass shattered, one of the tiki torches maybe, or a window. The old man tripped on a cooler and went down hard, pulling me with him. My knees hit the concrete patio, and the pain was sharp and immediate. But I forced myself up, forced him up because I could hear another fuse crackling in that terrible countdown rhythm. The backyard had descended into absolute chaos. Folding chairs were everywhere, knocked over by people trying to flee in every direction at once. I saw Donna sprinting toward the side gate with her son in her arms, his face buried against her shoulder. Someone was crying, a high-pitched keening sound that mixed with the ongoing explosions overhead. Vic was shouting something I could not understand, waving his arms near the fallen rack like he could somehow will it back into position. Another mortar launched from the tilted frame, and this one went low and fast, skipping off the grass before detonating against the back wall of the house. Stucco crumbled and rained down in chunks. A window on the second floor shattered outward, spraying glass onto the crowd below. I felt something sting my forearm and looked down to see blood, a thin line where a shard had sliced through my skin. The pain was distant, unreal. All I could think about was finding Kayla. I spotted her near the back door, crouched behind an overturned patio table with two other women. Her eyes found mine across the yard, and even in the strobing light of the fireworks still launching from the upright racks, I could see how terrified she was. Her mouth was forming my name, but no sound reached me through the cacophony. I started moving toward her, staying low, weaving between abandoned chairs and spilled drinks. The grass was slick with something, beer maybe, or the sangria from a shattered pitcher. My foot caught on a power cord and I nearly went down again, catching myself on the edge of a plastic table at the last second. Another mortar fired from the fallen rack, and I watched it arc sideways into the neighbor's yard. The explosion lit up the fence line, and I heard a woman over there start screaming in Spanish. The whole neighborhood was awake now, porch lights flicking on up and down the street, but nobody could help us. The remaining tubes were still loaded, still connected to whatever chain of fuses Vic had rigged, and they were going to keep firing until every last one was spent. I reached Kayla and pulled her into a crouch beside me, both of us pressed against the side of the house where a small overhang offered some protection. Her whole body was trembling, and when she grabbed my hand, her fingers were ice cold despite the warm Arizona night. She kept saying she was sorry over and over, like this was somehow her fault for inviting me. I told her to stop, that we needed to focus, that we needed to get inside the house. The sliding glass door was maybe 15 feet away, but crossing that open space felt like crossing a minefield. I counted the tubes I could still see on the fallen rack. 4, maybe 5. It was hard to tell in the chaos. Each one was a bomb waiting to go off in a random direction. Vic had finally backed away from the equipment, his face pale and slack, all that earlier confidence completely gone. He was just standing there, frozen, while people ran past him toward any exit they could find. I wanted to scream at him, to ask him what kind of professional lets something like this happen, but there was no time. The next fuse was already sparking. I grabbed Kayla by the wrist and we ran. Not toward the sliding door anymore. There were too many people crowding that entrance, pushing and shoving in blind panic. Instead, I pulled her along the side of the house, toward the narrow gate that led to the front yard. The space between the house and the fence was barely wide enough for us to move single file, and I could feel the heat from the explosions radiating off the stucco wall beside me. Another mortar fired behind us and the sound was deafening. A crack followed by a roar that seemed to vibrate through my entire skeleton. Something whizzed past overhead, trailing orange sparks. We burst through the gate and stumbled onto the front lawn just as the last few tubes emptied themselves into the night. From this angle, I could see the damage clearly. The scorched fence, the blackened patch of grass, the smoke pouring from a hole in the side of the house where one of the mortars had punched through. Fire was licking at the edges of that hole, small but growing. Someone was already on the phone with 911. Sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer. The aftermath felt like waking up from a nightmare only to find out everything was real. Paramedics treated 7 people for burns, cuts, and smoke inhalation. Donna's son had a piece of wood embedded in his calf that required surgery. He still walks with a slight limp today. The old man I had dragged to safety suffered a mild heart attack from the stress and spent 3 days in the hospital. Vic faced criminal charges for reckless endangerment and operating unlicensed fireworks in a residential area. Turned out his connections were just a guy he knew who smuggled professional-grade mortars from Mexico, and he had no real training at all. Kayla's house needed over $40,000 in repairs. She sold it 6 months later and moved to a different state. Said she could not stand being in that backyard anymore. I still have a faint scar on my forearm where the glass sliced me, a thin white line that catches the light when I move a certain way. Every New Year's Eve since then, I stay inside with all the curtains drawn. When midnight comes and the fireworks start outside, I put on noise-canceling headphones and turn the television up as loud as it will go. Some sounds you just never want to hear again. January 1st, 2024, started with my pager going off at 6 in the morning. Volunteer firefighting in rural Hendricks County, Indiana had been part of my life for about 3 years at that point, long enough to have seen my share of car wrecks, kitchen fires, and the occasional barn collapse. My wife Shelley groaned next to me in bed, still half asleep from the New Year's Eve party we had hosted the night before. I kissed her forehead, threw on my gear, and drove my pickup through the frozen darkness toward State Road 39. The dispatcher said it was a single vehicle accident. SUV versus a drainage ditch. Possible entrapment. Standard stuff for icy roads and hungover drivers who thought they could make it home after celebrating too hard. Having just turned 34 the previous month, I figured I had seen enough of these calls to know exactly what to expect. I remember thinking I would be back in time for breakfast with the kids. When I arrived at the scene, the sun was just starting to bleed pink and orange across the flat Indiana farmland. The SUV, a dark green Ford Explorer, maybe 2018 model, had gone off the road and flipped into the frozen ditch at an ugly angle. Chief Randy Bowman was already there with his truck, along with 2 other volunteers, Cliff Sanger and a newer guy named Pete, who had joined us maybe 6 months prior. The driver was out of the vehicle, sitting on the frozen ground about 15 feet away from the wreck, and I could see blood running down the side of his face even from a distance. He was a white male, maybe mid-40s, wearing a heavy coat and jeans, and he was rocking back and forth slowly like a man in shock. I grabbed my medical bag and started walking toward him, but something about the way Chief Bowman was standing near the SUV made me pause. He had this look on his face, not panic, but something close to confusion mixed with concern, and he waved me over before I could reach the injured driver. "Garrett, come take a look at this," Randy said in a low voice as I approached. He was shining his flashlight into the back of the overturned Explorer, illuminating the cargo area through the shattered rear window. The vehicle was resting on its roof, so everything inside had collapsed downward in a mess of broken glass, loose items, and what looked like camping gear. But there was something else in there too. Something large, wrapped in a blue tarp and secured with bungee cords. The shape was unmistakable even before my brain fully processed what I was seeing. It was roughly 6 feet long, narrower at one end than the other, and the tarp had partially come loose during the crash, revealing what looked like a bare human foot sticking out from beneath the plastic. Pale, waxy, with toenails that had been painted a dark shade of red. I took a step back without meaning to, my boots crunching against the frozen gravel. Randy grabbed my arm and pulled me aside, away from the vehicle, his breath coming out in thick white clouds. "I already called dispatch," he whispered. "Sheriff's on the way, but that's going to be at least 30 minutes, maybe more with these roads." I looked back at the driver, who was still sitting on the ground in that slow rocking motion, blood dripping from a gash somewhere above his hairline. Pete had approached him now and was trying to get him to respond to questions, but the man seemed completely unaware of his surroundings. His eyes were open but vacant, staring at nothing in particular, and his lips were moving slightly like he was talking to himself. Cliff jogged over to where Randy and I were standing, his face flushed from the cold. "What's the situation with the vehicle? We need to check for other passengers or—" Randy cut him off with a sharp shake of his head. "Nobody touches that SUV until the sheriff gets here. We got a situation." He didn't elaborate, but something in his tone made Cliff go quiet immediately. The 4 of us stood there in the growing morning light, the frozen cornfields stretching out in every direction, and I became acutely aware of how isolated we were. The nearest farmhouse was probably half a mile away, and there wasn't another vehicle in sight on the long, straight ribbon of State Road 39. Just us, the overturned Explorer, the bleeding man, and whatever was wrapped in that blue tarp. I told Randy I should at least try to treat the driver's head wound before he bled out or went into shock, and he agreed with a reluctant nod. As a volunteer firefighter with EMT basic certification, stabilizing injured people was part of the job, even when those people might be involved in something criminal. I grabbed my kit and walked over to where Pete was crouching beside the man, trying unsuccessfully to get him to make eye contact. Up close, I could see the driver more clearly now. He was probably 45 or 50, with a thick build and rough hands that suggested manual labor, construction, maybe, or farm work. His face was weathered and lined, his hair cut short and streaked with gray, and there was a small scar running through his left eyebrow that looked old, maybe decades old. The gash on his head was about 2 inches long, bleeding steadily but not catastrophically, located just above his right temple. I introduced myself, told him I was there to help, and asked if he could tell me his name. He didn't respond. His lips kept moving in that silent mutter, and when I leaned closer to try to hear what he was saying, I caught fragments of words that didn't quite connect, something about not supposed to be here, and she made me promise. I cleaned the wound as best I could and applied a pressure bandage while Pete held a flashlight steady. The man didn't flinch, didn't react at all to my touch, which was concerning on its own. Head injuries can do strange things to people, and I had seen accident victims act completely detached from reality before, their brains struggling to process trauma. But there was something different about this guy, something in the way he held his body, rigid, almost defensive, like he was bracing for an attack that hadn't come yet. When I finished with the bandage, I tried again. "Sir, can you tell me what happened? Were you driving alone?" For the first time, his eyes focused, locking onto my face with an intensity that made me want to lean back. His pupils were uneven, which suggested a concussion, but there was awareness behind them now. Real, frightened awareness. "You can't look in there," he said, his voice hoarse and cracked. "Please, you have to understand. You can't look in there." I kept my voice calm, professional, the way we were trained. "Sir, we've already seen what's in the vehicle. The sheriff is on his way. Right now, I need to make sure you're okay." His face crumpled, and for a moment I thought he was going to cry. Instead, he grabbed my wrist with a grip that was surprisingly strong and pulled me closer, his breath sour and metallic from the blood he had swallowed. "She was already dead," he whispered. "I swear to God she was already dead when I found her." I pulled my wrist free and stood up, my heart beating faster than I wanted to admit. Randy had walked over during the exchange and heard the last part, his expression hardening into something unreadable. "Found her where?" he asked, his voice flat and controlled. The driver looked up at him, then back at me, then at Pete like he was calculating something in his damaged head. For a long moment, I thought he was going to shut down again, retreat back into that vacant stare. But instead he started talking, slowly at first, then faster, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. He said his name was Vernon Hatch, that he lived about 40 miles north in a town called Frankfort, that he worked as a groundskeeper at a private cemetery outside of Lafayette. He said he had been driving home from a New Year's Eve gathering at his brother's house when he saw the body on the side of the road, just lying there in the frozen grass near a bridge overpass. A woman, young, maybe late 20s, wearing nothing but a thin dress despite the freezing temperature. He said he stopped to check on her and realized immediately that she was dead. No pulse, no breath, her skin already cold and stiff. He panicked. He didn't know why, couldn't explain it even to himself, but something in his brain told him that if he called the police, they would blame him. So he wrapped her in a tarp he had in his truck, loaded her into the back of his SUV, and started driving with no clear destination in mind. That was when he hit the ice patch and lost control. None of us said anything for a long moment after he finished. The sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the frozen landscape, and I could hear the distant sound of a truck engine somewhere down the road. Vernon Hatch sat there on the frozen ground, his bandaged head drooping, his hands trembling in his lap. His story was insane, The kind of thing that sounded like a lie specifically because no rational person would ever do what he claimed to have done. But there was something in his voice, in the way his eyes kept darting toward the overturned Explorer, that made me wonder. I had dealt with liars before, people who caused accidents and tried to blame road conditions or other drivers or mechanical failures. They usually had a smoothness to them, a practiced quality to their excuses. Vernon didn't have that. He sounded like a man who had made a catastrophic decision in a moment of panic and was only now realizing the full weight of what he had done. Randy crouched down in front of him, his knees popping in the cold air. "You're telling me you found a dead woman on the side of the road, and instead of calling 911, you decided to put her in your vehicle and drive away?" Vernon nodded miserably. "I know how it sounds, I know. But I'm telling you the truth. I didn't hurt her. I didn't even know her. She was just lying there, and I didn't know what to do." The sound of the approaching engine grew louder, and I turned to see a Hendricks County Sheriff's cruiser coming down State Road 39, its lights flashing but no siren. Behind it, maybe a quarter-mile back, I could see what looked like an ambulance. Relief washed through me. This was no longer our problem to figure out. Whatever Vernon Hatch had done or hadn't done, it was about to become a matter for people with badges and investigative authority. Deputy Connie Russo stepped out of the cruiser, a tall woman in her early 50s with short gray hair and a face that looked like it had seen every kind of human ugliness over a long career. She took in the scene with quick, practiced eyes. The overturned SUV, the injured man on the ground, the four of us standing around in our firefighter gear looking like we had just witnessed something we couldn't quite process. Randy walked over to meet her, and I watched them have a brief, intense conversation, their breath fogging in the cold air. Deputy Russo's expression didn't change, but I saw her hand move to rest on her holster as she glanced toward Vernon. She said something into her radio, then walked over to where he was sitting and crouched down in front of him, her posture calm but alert. I couldn't hear what she said to him, but I saw Vernon start talking again, his hands gesturing weakly as he repeated his story. The paramedics arrived and started working on Vernon while Deputy Russo walked over to the SUV with Randy and shined her flashlight into the cargo area. I stayed back with Pete and Cliff, the three of us watching in silence as she examined the blue tarp and its contents. After a few minutes, she stood up and made another radio call, her voice too low for me to hear the words, but her tone unmistakably serious. More units were coming. I could tell that much from the way she kept looking down the road, waiting. Pete lit a cigarette with shaking hands and offered me one, but I shook my head. "You think he's telling the truth?" he asked quietly. "About finding her like that?" I didn't have an answer. The whole situation felt surreal, like something from a crime documentary rather than a Tuesday morning in rural Indiana. I kept thinking about that foot sticking out from under the tarp, the dark red nail polish, the waxy pallor of the skin. Somebody's daughter, somebody's sister, maybe somebody's mother. Whoever she was, she had been alive not too long ago. And now she was a body in the back of a wrecked SUV, and the only person who might know what happened to her was a man who claimed he had just been trying to do the right thing in the worst possible way. Over the next hour, the scene transformed into something out of a procedural drama. 2 more sheriff's vehicles arrived, followed by a state police cruiser and a white van from the county coroner's office. Yellow crime scene tape went up around the SUV, and a perimeter was established that pushed us volunteer firefighters to the edge of the action. Vernon Hatch was loaded into the ambulance, still talking to anyone who would listen, his bandaged head turning frantically as Deputy Russo rode along with him. I overheard one of the state troopers mention that they were sending units to check the bridge overpass Vernon had described, about 20 miles north on a county road near the Tippecanoe County line. Randy pulled us together near his truck and told us we were free to go, that our job here was done, but none of us moved right away. There was an unspoken understanding that we had stumbled into something bigger than a simple traffic accident, and walking away felt incomplete somehow. Cliff finally broke the silence by saying he needed to get home to his kids, and Pete muttered something about needing coffee, and slowly we drifted back to our vehicles. I sat in my pickup for a long moment before starting the engine, watching the coroner's team carefully extract the blue tarp from the overturned Explorer. The shape inside was unmistakably human, and even from 50 yards away I could see the stiffness of the limbs, the unnatural angles that only death can create. I drove home in a daze, my mind running through everything I had seen and heard. Shelley was awake when I walked in, making pancakes for our 2 boys, and she took one look at my face and asked what was wrong. I told her it had been a rough call but didn't go into details. Some things you don't bring to the breakfast table, especially not with a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old asking why Daddy looks so tired. I ate mechanically, showered, and tried to sleep. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that foot sticking out from under the tarp, the dark red polish on the toenails. I kept thinking about Vernon Hatch and his impossible story, the fear in his eyes when he grabbed my wrist, the desperation in his voice when he swore he hadn't hurt her. Part of me wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that he really was just a panicked idiot who made a catastrophic decision on a freezing highway in the middle of the night. But another part of me, the part that had seen the way he avoided looking at the SUV, the way his hands trembled even before I touched his wound, couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than he was telling. The news broke 2 days later. I was at the fire station doing equipment maintenance when Randy called me into his office and showed me the article on his computer screen. The woman in the tarp had been identified as Marissa Keene, 31 years old, a dental hygienist from West Lafayette, who had been reported missing by her roommate on New Year's Eve. According to the preliminary coroner's report, she had died from blunt force trauma to the head, and the estimated time of death was somewhere between 10 in the evening and 2 in the morning on December 31st, hours before Vernon Hatch claimed to have found her body on the side of the road. The article went on to say that Hatch had been arrested and charged with murder, that investigators had found evidence linking him to the victim, and that he was being held without bail pending further investigation. I read the words twice, 3 times, trying to reconcile them with the man I had treated on that frozen highway. The scared, confused, desperate man who had grabbed my wrist and sworn he was innocent. Randy closed the browser and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes with the heels of his hands. "Hell of a way to start the new year," he said quietly. I nodded but didn't respond. There was nothing to say that would make any of it make sense. The details came out slowly over the following weeks, pieced together from news reports and courtroom documents and the occasional conversation with Deputy Russo, who I ran into at a gas station one evening in late January. Vernon Hatch, it turned out, had known Marissa Keene. They had met at a grief support group in Lafayette about 8 months earlier. Vernon had lost his wife to cancer in 2022, and Marissa had lost her younger brother in a motorcycle accident. According to witnesses from the group, they had formed a friendship that Vernon apparently misinterpreted as something more. When Marissa gently rejected his advances, he became obsessive, showing up at her workplace, sending dozens of text messages, leaving notes on her car. She had filed for a restraining order just 2 weeks before her death, but it hadn't been processed yet. On New Year's Eve, investigators believed, Vernon followed her from a party she had attended with friends, forced her off the road near that bridge overpass, and killed her in a rage. The tarp, the bungee cords, the whole elaborate story about finding her body. It was all a desperate attempt to create an alibi that fell apart the moment he lost control of his SUV on the ice. Vernon Hatch was convicted of first-degree murder in September of that year and sentenced to life without parole. I didn't attend the trial, but I followed it in the news, reading every article I could find like I was searching for something that would help me understand. The thing that haunts me even now isn't the image of that foot sticking out from under the tarp, or the way Marissa Keene's family wept in the courtroom when the verdict was read. It's the way Vernon looked at me on that frozen highway, the way he grabbed my wrist and begged me to believe him. In that moment, I did believe him. I looked into his eyes and saw what I thought was genuine terror, genuine confusion, and I felt sorry for him. I've been a volunteer firefighter long enough to think I can read people, to trust my instincts about who's telling the truth and who's lying. But Vernon Hatch fooled me completely. He sat there with blood running down his face and told me a story so absurd that it almost sounded true. And I bought it. I think about that sometimes when I respond to calls now, when I'm treating someone at an accident scene or a house fire and they're telling me what happened. I think about how easy it is to believe someone who seems scared, who seems vulnerable, who seems like a victim. And I remember that the real victim that morning was wrapped in a blue tarp in the back of an overturned SUV, silent and cold, while her killer sat 15 feet away convincing me he was innocent. That's what stays with me. That's what I can't forget. The knowledge that I looked evil in the face and felt nothing but sympathy. Celebrating my birthday on December 31st always felt like a blessing and a curse. On one hand, the whole world throws a party. On the other, good luck getting anyone to focus on you when fireworks and champagne are involved. By 2024, after graduating college in 2017 and spending years building a career in marketing, I figured I deserved one night of real celebration. My friend Heather had been raving about this upscale nightclub downtown called Velour for months. One of those places where the cocktails cost $20 and the bouncers wear earpieces like Secret Service agents. She convinced me that ringing in the new year there would be the perfect way to mark another trip around the sun. I spent $200 on a sequined dress and another $50 on heels I could barely walk in. Heather picked me up around 10, and we arrived just as the line was wrapping around the block. The bass from inside vibrated through the concrete, and I remember thinking this was exactly what I needed. The interior of Velour matched every expectation I had built in my head. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, casting prismatic light across a dance floor packed with bodies moving in synchronized chaos. VIP sections were roped off with velvet, occupied by people who looked like they belonged in magazine spreads. Heather grabbed my wrist and pulled me toward the main bar, where 3 bartenders in matching black vests were shaking cocktails like performers. I ordered a single vodka cranberry, my only drink of the night, wanting to stay sharp enough to actually remember the countdown. Heather disappeared into the crowd around 11, chasing after some guy she recognized from her spin class, and I found a spot near one of the tall tables overlooking the dance floor. The music was loud, the energy electric, and I felt genuinely happy for the first time in months. I checked my phone, saw it was 11:42, and started scanning the room for Heather so we could find a good spot for midnight. That was when a man in a server uniform approached my table carrying a tray with a single champagne flute. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with a shaved head and a jawline sharp enough to cut glass. His uniform matched the other staff members perfectly. Black vest, white dress shirt, even the little gold pin on his collar that said Velour in cursive script. He smiled and placed the glass in front of me, leaning in close to be heard over the music. "Complimentary champagne for the countdown," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the bar. I thanked him without a second thought. This was exactly the kind of thing upscale clubs did, especially on New Year's Eve. He nodded once and disappeared into the crowd before I could even ask if he had seen a redhead in a green dress, which was Heather. The champagne looked expensive, with tiny bubbles rising in perfect columns, and I brought it to my lips without hesitation. The first sip tasted slightly bitter, which I attributed to whatever high-end brand they were pouring. I took another small sip and set the glass down, turning my attention back to the dance floor. 11:47. The DJ was building toward something, layering beats that made the whole room pulse like a single living organism. I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me, subtle at first, like standing up too fast. I gripped the edge of the table and blinked hard, trying to focus. The light seemed brighter, the music louder, and the faces around me started to blur at the edges. My legs felt heavy, as if someone had filled my shoes with wet sand. I had experienced tipsy before, and this was not that. 1 vodka cranberry and 2 sips of champagne should not have done this to me. My vision started narrowing, the periphery going dark like someone was slowly closing curtains on either side of my eyes. I fumbled for my phone, but my fingers felt thick and clumsy, disconnected from my brain. I needed to move. I needed to find Heather, find a security guard, find anyone who could help me. I pushed myself away from the table and immediately stumbled, catching myself on the arm of a stranger who barely glanced at me, before turning back to his conversation. The room was spinning now, Not dramatically like in movies, but in slow tilts that made every step feel like walking on a ship in rough waters. I aimed for the restrooms, remembering they were near the back hallway, past the second bar. People bumped into me constantly, too absorbed in their own celebrations to notice a woman struggling to stay upright. The countdown clock on the main screen showed 11:51, 9 minutes until the new year. 9 minutes until everyone would be screaming and kissing and completely oblivious to anything else happening around them. I made it maybe 20 feet before two men appeared on either side of me, one grabbing my elbow and the other placing a hand on my lower back. "Hey, there she is," the one on my left said loudly, his voice carrying a practiced cheerfulness that made my stomach turn. "We have been looking everywhere for you." He was shorter than the man who gave me the champagne, stocky with a thick neck and a goatee that looked like it had been drawn on with a marker. The other one was younger, maybe mid-20s, with sandy hair and a polo shirt that screamed fraternity alumni. They moved in perfect coordination, guiding me toward the back of the club like they had done this 100 times before. I tried to pull away, but my arm felt like it belonged to someone else. "She always does this," the younger one said to a couple who glanced our way, shaking his head with an exasperated smile. "Too much champagne, you know how it is." The couple laughed and returned to their drinks. Nobody questioned it. Nobody asked if I was okay. It was New Year's Eve, and everyone assumed I was just another drunk girl being helped home by her friends. Somewhere deep in the fog, clouding my brain, a survival instinct kicked in. I remembered reading somewhere that you should make a scene, be loud, be difficult, because predators rely on compliance. I planted my heels into the floor as hard as I could, which was not very hard given my condition, and let out a sound that was meant to be a scream, but came out more like a strangled moan. The stocky one tightened his grip on my elbow, his fingers digging in hard enough to leave bruises I would find the next morning. "Easy now," he muttered close to my ear, his breath hot and smelling like whiskey. "You are making a scene." I saw the restroom sign glowing maybe 15 feet ahead and made a decision. I went completely limp, letting my body drop like dead weight. The move caught them off guard, and for a split second their grip loosened. I threw myself sideways, crashing into a group of women in matching silver dresses who shrieked and spilled their drinks everywhere. The chaos gave me just enough cover to crawl on my hands and knees, toward the bathroom door. I do not remember pushing the door open. I do not remember locking myself in the handicap stall at the far end. What I remember is pressing my back against the cold tile wall and fumbling with my phone, my vision swimming so badly that the screen looked like it was underwater. I managed to pull up the number for the club, which I had saved earlier in case Heather and I got separated. A woman answered on the third ring, barely audible over the music bleeding through the line. "I need security," I said, or at least I tried to say. The words came out slurred and broken. "Someone drugged me. 2 men, trying to take me out." There was a pause, then her voice sharpened. "Where are you right now?" "Bathroom," I managed. "Back hallway." "Stay there," she said. "Do not move. Do not open the door for anyone except security. They will knock 3 times and say the word midnight." I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the floor, my sequined dress bunched up around my thighs, and I waited. The bathroom door opened twice while I sat there. The first time, I heard heels clicking on tile and 2 women laughing about someone named Brad who had apparently kissed the wrong girl at the bar. They fixed their makeup, complained about the line, and left without ever knowing I was 10 feet away fighting to stay conscious. The second time was worse. The door creaked open slowly, and there were no voices, no heels, just the soft thud of flat shoes on tile. I held my breath, which was difficult because my lungs felt like they were wrapped in plastic. The footsteps moved methodically, stopping at each stall. I watched the shadow pass under the gap at the bottom of my door, a dark shape that paused for just a moment too long. Then a knock. Not 3 knocks. Just one, slow and deliberate. I pressed my hand over my mouth to keep from making any sound. The shadow lingered, and I could hear breathing on the other side of the door, patient and unhurried. Then the main bathroom door burst open and a woman's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Security, we are clearing the restroom." The shadow retreated instantly, footsteps quick and light, disappearing out the door before the security team could fully enter. I heard a woman's voice call out, asking if anyone needed assistance, and I finally let myself speak. "In here," I croaked. "Back stall." The lock clicked open from the outside, and I found myself staring up at a woman in a black polo with security printed across the chest in white letters. She was built like someone who had played college softball, broad shoulders and arms that looked like they could throw a punch without thinking twice. Behind her stood a man with a shaved head and a radio crackling on his hip. The woman crouched down to my level, her eyes scanning my face with a clinical efficiency that made me feel both safe and terrified. "Can you tell me what happened?" I told her everything I could remember, my words still thick and clumsy. The champagne, the man in the server uniform, the two men who tried to take me outside. She exchanged a look with her partner that told me this was not the first time they had heard a story like mine. They brought me to a back office, a small room cluttered with monitors showing feeds from cameras positioned throughout the club. The countdown had already happened while I was on the bathroom floor, and confetti still drifted through the main room like glitter snow. A manager named Vince, a heavy-set man with kind eyes and a receding hairline, sat me down with a bottle of water and started pulling up footage. The female security guard, whose name was Jackie, stayed by my side the entire time. Within minutes, they found him. The man in the server uniform appeared on camera at 11:38, walking through a service entrance near the loading dock. He was not on the employee roster. He had acquired a staff wristband from somewhere, probably stolen it off a real server, and had walked through the back hallways like he belonged there. On another monitor, they tracked him moving through the crowd, champagne flute in hand, stopping at my table for less than 30 seconds before vanishing again. Vince rewound and zoomed in, and I saw it clearly. The moment before he approached me, he pulled a small vial from his pocket and tipped something into the glass. But what made me feel truly sick was the footage from the back exit. Starting around 11:50, the same man appeared on the camera covering the rear door, the one that led to the alley behind the club. He checked the handle. He looked at his phone. He paced a few steps away, then came back. Every 2 or 3 minutes he repeated this pattern, his eyes fixed on the door like a predator waiting at a watering hole. The timestamp in the corner ticked past midnight, past 12:15, past 12:30. He only left when a delivery truck pulled into the alley at 12:42, headlights flooding the area and forcing him to retreat into the shadows and eventually out of frame. The two men who had tried to escort me out of the club never appeared on that camera. Jackie told me they had probably been stationed inside to guide targets toward the exit, while the man outside handled whatever came next. Targets. She used that word like it was routine, like they had a whole system figured out. The police arrived around 1 in the morning. 2 detectives, a man and a woman, took my statement, while a paramedic checked my vitals and drew blood to confirm what everyone already knew. They found traces of gamma-hydroxybutyrate in my system, the same substance that shows up in dozens of cases like mine every year. Heather finally appeared around 1:30. Mascara streaked down her face, sobbing and apologizing for disappearing. I did not have the energy to be angry with her. The detectives told me they would pull the footage, run facial recognition, do everything they could. But their tone carried a weight I recognized, the kind of professional pessimism that comes from working too many cases that go nowhere. The men knew how to avoid being identified. They wore no distinctive clothing, had no visible tattoos, and the camera angles never captured a clear shot of the tall one's face. The wristband had been reported stolen by a server who noticed it missing around 10:45, but assumed he had simply misplaced it in the chaos of the night. These men had done this before. They would probably do it again. I spent New Year's Day in bed, curtains drawn, jumping at every sound from the hallway outside my apartment. Heather stayed with me for 3 days straight, sleeping on my couch and checking the locks every few hours. The bruises on my arm turned purple, then yellow, then faded into nothing. The police called twice over the following weeks, once to confirm the toxicology results, and once to tell me they had not been able to identify any of the 3 men. The case went cold, filed away with hundreds of others just like it. I still think about that night, about the single knock on the bathroom stall door and the breathing on the other side. I think about the man waiting by the back exit, checking his phone, patient as a spider in a web. Sometimes I wonder if he found someone else that night after I escaped, someone who did not make it to the bathroom in time. I do not go to clubs anymore. I do not accept drinks I did not watch being poured. And every December 31st, while the rest of the world celebrates, I stay home with the doors locked and the lights on, grateful to be alive and terrified of the people who tried to make sure I would not be. New Year's Eve has always been my excuse to stay indoors. While everyone else floods the streets and packs into bars, I prefer the quiet of my own apartment. A modest 2-bedroom unit on the 3rd floor of a building in a working-class neighborhood just outside of Houston. My sister Vicky keeps telling me I need to get out more, that turning 34 means nothing if I spend every holiday like a hermit. But after 10 years working as an HVAC technician, crawling through attics and dealing with people's broken units all day, the last thing I want is to squeeze into some overcrowded venue with strangers screaming in my ear. That Wednesday night, December 31st, 2023, felt like any other quiet celebration to me. I had invited my buddy Jerome and his wife Patty over for some food, a few beers, and whatever countdown show was playing on TV. Nothing fancy, nothing wild, just 3 people in their 30s acting their age for once. My apartment sat on Ridgecrest Drive, a street that got louder every year as the neighborhood changed, but I figured the noise would die down by 1 or 2 in the morning like it always did. Jerome and Patty left around 12:30, right after we watched the ball drop and clinked our bottles together. Patty had to work an early shift at the hospital the next morning, so they didn't stick around long. I remember standing at my door, waving them off as they walked down the outdoor corridor toward the stairwell, their footsteps echoing against the concrete. The air outside was thick with the smell of gunpowder and barbecue smoke, and I could hear fireworks popping somewhere in the distance, or at least what I assumed were fireworks. That distinction would matter a lot more in about 20 minutes. I closed the door, locked the deadbolt, and started gathering up the paper plates and empty bottles from my coffee table. My TV was still on, some post-midnight coverage showing celebrations in Times Square, and I had this peaceful feeling in my chest like the night had gone exactly as planned. I carried the trash into the kitchen, tossed it in the bin under the sink, and grabbed a wet rag to wipe down the counter. Everything was calm, everything was normal, and I had no idea that my ceiling was about to explode. I was wiping down the kitchen counter when I heard the first crack. It wasn't like a firework. Fireworks have that whistling buildup, that theatrical pause before the boom. This was sharp, sudden, like someone snapping a thick branch right above my head. I looked up at the ceiling just in time to see a chunk of drywall the size of my fist come loose and tumble down onto my living room carpet. Dust puffed up from the impact, little white particles floating in the glow of my floor lamp. For a second I just stood there with the wet rag in my hand, trying to process what I was seeing. My first thought was that something had fallen on the roof, maybe a piece of debris from a firework or some drunk idiot throwing something off a balcony. But then I noticed the hole, a small, dark puncture in the ceiling surrounded by cracked plaster, perfectly round, like someone had driven a nail through from the apartment above. Except there was no apartment above me. I lived on the top floor, and above my ceiling was nothing but roofing material and open Texas sky. I walked over slowly, my brain still not catching up to what my eyes were telling me. The debris on the carpet wasn't just drywall. There was something else mixed in, something small and metallic glinting under the lamplight. I crouched down and saw it clearly. A bullet, deformed and flattened on one side, sitting right there on my beige carpet like it belonged there. I picked it up without thinking, and the heat surprised me so much that I almost dropped it. The metal was warm, not burning hot, but definitely warm. The kind of temperature you feel when you grab a coffee mug that's been sitting out for 10 minutes. My mind raced through possibilities. A gun accident in a neighboring building, some kind of malfunction, maybe a hunter somewhere outside the city limits. None of it made sense. I was standing in my own living room holding a bullet that had just fallen from my ceiling. And outside, I could still hear what sounded like 100 firecrackers going off in every direction. That's when the second shot came through. This one was closer. Way closer. The crack was louder, more violent, and a spray of white dust erupted from the ceiling maybe 6 feet to my left, right above the edge of my couch. I watched in horror as a second chunk of drywall broke loose and crashed onto the cushions, followed by another bullet that bounced off the armrest and rolled onto the floor. My body finally caught up to my brain, and I dropped to my knees behind the kitchen island, pressing my back against the cabinets. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat, in my temples, in my fingertips. Someone was shooting at my apartment. That was the only thought I could form. Someone was shooting at my apartment, and I had no idea who or why. I pressed myself lower, trying to make myself as small as possible, my cheek against the cold tile floor. The popcorn ceiling above me suddenly looked like a minefield, every inch of it a potential entry point for the next round. I could hear more pops outside, more cracks, more explosions that I now knew weren't fireworks at all. I fumbled for my phone in my pocket, my fingers clumsy and uncooperative. The screen lit up and I dialed 911, pressing the phone hard against my ear while keeping my body flat behind the island. It rang 4 times before someone picked up, and the voice on the other end sounded exhausted, overwhelmed like they'd already answered 1,000 calls that night. I tried to explain what was happening. Bullets coming through my ceiling, 2 shots already, I'm hiding in my kitchen. But the words came out jumbled and frantic. The dispatcher asked for my address and I gave it to her, spelling out Ridgecrest Drive twice because she couldn't hear me over the noise in the background on her end. Then she said something that made my entire body go cold. She told me that they were receiving dozens of calls about gunfire across the city, that officers were stretched thin responding to shootings and accidents, and that it might be 30 to 40 minutes before anyone could get to my location. 30 to 40 minutes. I was lying on my kitchen floor with bullets punching through my roof, and the best they could offer was maybe an hour. The dispatcher told me to stay low and stay away from windows, like I needed instructions on how to not get shot. She said she'd keep my call logged as a priority, but I could hear the doubt in her voice, the resignation of someone who knew the system was failing in real time. I thanked her anyway and hung up, then immediately called Jerome. He picked up on the second ring, his voice groggy like he'd already fallen asleep in the car ride home. I told him what was happening, speaking fast and low, and I heard Patty gasp in the background when she understood. Jerome wanted to come back, wanted to drive over right then. But I told him no. The streets were chaos. People were firing guns into the air everywhere. And the last thing I needed was my best friend catching a stray bullet on his way to save me. He made me promise to keep texting him every few minutes, to let him know I was still okay. I promised, even though I had no idea if I would be okay, if any of us would be okay, if this nightmare would ever end. I army crawled from the kitchen toward the hallway, keeping my body as flat as possible against the tile. My bathroom was at the end of the hall, a small, windowless room with a cast-iron bathtub that my landlord had never bothered to replace. In that moment, that old ugly tub seemed like the safest place in the world, surrounded by walls on all sides, no ceiling exposure to the roof, just solid porcelain and iron between me and whatever was falling from the sky. I pulled myself along the floor, my elbows burning against the rough surface, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts. Another crack echoed somewhere outside, followed by a whoop of celebration and more gunfire. I realized then what was happening, why the bullets were coming down at random angles, why the police couldn't stop it. It wasn't a shooting in the traditional sense. It was celebratory gunfire. People all over the neighborhood, maybe all over the city, firing their pistols straight up into the air to ring in the new year. And what goes up, as they say, must come down. Every bullet that left those barrels was arcing through the night sky and falling back to earth with enough force to punch through roofing material, through drywall, through flesh and bone if you were unlucky enough to be in its path. I made it to the bathroom and climbed into the tub, pulling myself over the cold porcelain edge and curling up at the bottom like a child hiding from a thunderstorm. The cast iron pressed against my spine, hard and unforgiving, but I didn't care. I lay there in the dark, staring up at the bathroom ceiling, listening to the chaos outside. Every pop made me flinch. Every crack sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. I kept my phone clutched against my chest, the screen lighting up every few minutes with texts from Jerome asking if I was still alive. I typed back one-word responses. Yes, okay, still here. Because I couldn't manage anything more. Time moved strangely in that bathtub. Minutes felt like hours, and hours felt like days. I could hear music playing from somewhere down the street, bass thumping through the walls, people laughing and shouting like the world wasn't raining bullets. At one point, I heard a woman scream, a sharp piercing sound that cut through everything else, and I pressed my palms over my ears and squeezed my eyes shut and prayed it wasn't what I thought it was. The third bullet came through around 1:15 in the morning. I heard it hit somewhere in the apartment, a distant thud followed by the familiar sound of debris falling. I didn't move from the bathtub. I couldn't move. My legs had gone numb from the awkward position, and my back was screaming from being pressed against the hard surface for so long, but none of that mattered. I just lay there, counting the seconds between each burst of gunfire outside, trying to calculate how many more rounds might be headed my way. I thought about my mom, who lived alone in a single-story house on the other side of town, and wondered if she was safe. I thought about Jerome and Patty, probably home by now, probably lying in their bed unable to sleep. I thought about all the New Year's Eves I had spent complaining about the noise, rolling my eyes at the reckless idiots shooting their guns into the air, never once imagining that I would end up cowering in my bathtub while their bullets punched holes through my home. The gunfire outside seemed to come in waves, intense barrages followed by brief moments of quiet, then building up again like a storm that refused to pass. Somewhere around 2:30, the shooting started to slow down. The gaps between bursts grew longer, the pops more scattered, the whoops and cheers less frequent. I stayed in the tub anyway, not trusting the silence, not trusting anything. My phone battery had dropped to 12%, and I watched it tick down with growing anxiety, knowing that if something else happened, I might not be able to call for help. At 3 in the morning, I finally heard sirens, not coming to my building, but somewhere nearby, maybe a block or two over. I wondered if someone had been hit, if that woman's scream I heard earlier had been more than just fear. I wondered how many people across the city were lying in bathtubs just like me, or hiding under beds, or pressing themselves flat against floors while the sky rained metal. The thought made me feel less alone and more terrified at the same time. By 3:30, the gunfire had mostly stopped, replaced by the distant wail of ambulances and the occasional bark of a dog. I waited another 30 minutes before I trusted myself to move, my muscles stiff and aching as I pulled myself up and over the edge of the tub. I walked through my apartment like a survivor, surveying the wreckage after a natural disaster. The living room was covered in a thin layer of white dust from the ceiling damage. I found 3 holes total, one above the carpet where the first bullet came through, one above the couch from the second, and a third near my bedroom door that I hadn't even heard happen. The bullets themselves were scattered across the floor, small deformed pieces of metal that had traveled through the night sky before crashing into my life. I picked them up one by one and dropped them into a glass jar on my kitchen counter, my hands still trembling from the adrenaline that hadn't fully left my system. The police finally showed up around 4:15, 2 exhausted officers who took photos of the damage and filled out a report that I knew would go nowhere. They told me that dozens of people had called in similar complaints, that at least 3 people in the greater Houston area had been hit by stray bullets that night, including a teenager who was in critical condition at Memorial Hermann. They gave me a case number and a pamphlet about victim services and wished me a happy new year on their way out the door. I moved out of that apartment 6 weeks later, broke my lease, paid the penalty, and found a ground floor unit in a quieter part of town where the neighbors are mostly retirees and young families. My landlord tried to charge me for the ceiling repairs, but I threatened to go to the local news with photos of the bullet holes, and he backed off pretty quick. Jerome helped me pack up my stuff, and when we carried the last box down to the moving truck, I looked up at my old living room window and felt nothing but relief. I still have those 3 bullets in that glass jar, sitting on a shelf in my new place like some kind of morbid souvenir. People ask me about them sometimes, and I tell them the story, and they always react the same way. Disbelief first, then horror. Then that uncomfortable silence that comes when someone realizes how close you came to not being here anymore. My sister Vicky says I should throw them away, that keeping them is unhealthy, but I disagree. I keep them because I need to remember how random it all was, how easily one of those rounds could have come through while I was standing up instead of crouching down. New Year's Eve came around again this past December, and I spent it at my mom's house on the other side of town, far from the neighborhoods where people still think firing guns into the air is a celebration. We watched the countdown on our old television, drank sparkling cider because she doesn't keep alcohol in the house, and when midnight hit, I flinched at every distant pop I heard outside. She noticed, of course. Moms always notice. And she put her hand on my arm and told me I was safe. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But the truth is, I don't think I'll ever hear fireworks the same way again. Every crack, every boom, every whistle sends my mind back to that bathtub, to those hours spent curled up against cold porcelain while the world fell apart above me. I survived that night by pure luck, nothing more. The bullets that came through my ceiling could have hit me just as easily as they hit the drywall. And somewhere out there, the people who fired those shots probably don't even know what they did. They probably woke up the next morning with hangovers and empty magazines, and no idea that their celebration almost ended my life. That's the part that haunts me the most. Not the fear, not the helplessness, but the randomness of it all. The complete and total randomness. The last night of that year still sits in my memory with this strange mix of excitement and static, like a song that cuts out right before the best part. I'd headed downtown with my friend Marissa because neither of us wanted to spend New Year's Eve alone in our apartments again. The city had turned the main square into this giant glowing stage, packed with food trucks, metallic confetti drifting over everyone's heads, and a countdown timer projected against a building that reflected the lights like a cracked mirror. I remember feeling almost weightless from the noise and the closeness of people leaning shoulder to shoulder, just trying to see the fireworks better. At that moment, everything felt safe, crowded, but safe. Marissa kept tugging at my sleeve, pointing at strangers' ridiculous hats or couples rehearsing kisses too early. We laugh the way you laugh when you're trying to convince yourself the year will be different just because the clock says so. The countdown hit 0, and the square erupted with a roar so loud it felt like the air thickened around us. People jumped, hugged, screamed, and that huge surge of bodies moved in every direction at once. Marissa and I lifted our phones to film, trying not to poke anyone in the eye, while fireworks exploded behind the skyscrapers in colors so bright they washed out the whole sky. It took maybe 2 minutes for the happy chaos to shift into something far more frantic. The crowd started pushing toward the metro entrance we needed to reach, and our steps got pulled into that tide whether we wanted them to or not. Marissa was right in front of me, literally an arm's length, her hair full of glitter, her silver scarf trailing like a tail behind her. I kept my eyes on that scarf because it became the only anchor I had in the movement. By the time we reached the sidewalk near the metro steps, that anchor slipped. A group surged between us, drunk and loud, and bodies shuttled us apart in this jittery sideways motion I couldn't control. I tried calling her name, but the fireworks drowned everything out. I could still see the top of her head, but the stream of people pushed her forward faster than me, almost funneling her toward the entrance. It didn't feel threatening, just messy, so I figured she was getting carried ahead and would wait for me downstairs. My boot slid slightly on crushed confetti, and someone bumped my shoulder hard enough to tilt my balance. When I regained it, her silver scarf was nowhere in sight. Still, that didn't alarm me yet. It was New Year's Eve. People were basically a living river at that point. Inside the station, the atmosphere felt tighter, like the walls were amplifying every leftover shout and every echo from the street above. Trains were pulling in and out non-stop, trying to move crowds before things turned into another headline about injuries near the square. I stepped into the first car that opened, scanning faces quickly, expecting to see Marissa waving me over with that mocking, "took you long enough" expression she always used. Instead, my phone buzzed right as the doors were about to close. The message preview lit up my screen in this stark white box that didn't match the celebration at all. It was from Marissa, sent seconds earlier, and it read, "Someone's pulling me. Help." The doors slid shut in front of me before I could step out. The train lurched forward, but my mind barely registered the movement. That message didn't match the tone of anything we'd lived in the past hour, and the wording hit me with this sharp clarity that cut through the leftover excitement. I squeezed past a couple leaning against the pole and hit the emergency intercom before I could second-guess myself. My voice came out too loud, telling the operator I needed to get off at the next stop immediately. People stared, but no one asked what was happening. Everyone looked exhausted from the crowd. When the train stopped, I pushed through the doors the second they opened and sprinted up the escalator 2 steps at a time, my heart slamming against my ribs in a messy rhythm that had nothing to do with panic attacks and everything to do with the fact that Marissa wasn't answering a single call. Outside, the fireworks were still echoing across the downtown buildings, masking sirens and shouts from somewhere close. When I reached the street level, the police presence had doubled. Officers were guiding injured people toward makeshift aid stations, and I overheard someone mention crush injuries near the center of the square. That only added to the mess in my head, but I forced myself to retrace our route as precisely as I could. Every block looked slightly distorted, as if the combination of smoke, confetti, and leftover bursts of light had thrown a filter over the city. I followed the path we'd carved through the crowd earlier, checking the ground for anything familiar. A glove, a hat, a metallic noisemaker. None of it mattered. None of it was hers. My brain kept clinging to the last clear image I had of her. That silver scarf dragging lightly against the pavement as she pushed toward the metro steps. It took me several minutes to reach the spot where we'd been separated, and that's when I noticed a shape on the ground that hadn't been there before. The scarf lay half-crumpled near the side of a maintenance doorway built into the station wall. The metal door was supposed to stay locked. Every local knew that. Yet it sat slightly ajar as if someone had nudged it with their foot while passing through. The scarf looked like it had been dropped mid-movement, not placed gently. I crouched and picked it up, and there was this faint smell of the cologne she'd been wearing earlier, mixed with something damp and metallic that didn't fit the night at all. I called her again, straight to voicemail. Something in my chest tightened, and I backed away just enough to catch a breath before leaning toward the doorway. Inside the narrow opening, a sliver of yellow light flickered, the kind produced by old bulbs that hum louder than they shine. The passage led downward, not deep, but enough that the sounds of the street faded into a muffled roar. A sign on the wall read, "Authorized personnel only," and the paint was peeling like bark off a dying tree. I hesitated because stepping in felt like breaking a boundary the city had drawn on purpose. But the scarf was still in my hand, and the message on my phone hadn't magically changed. I slipped through the doorway, keeping one hand on the wall because the floor slanted unevenly. The deeper I went, the more the tunnel carried this sharp smell of dust and wet concrete, and something else, something that reminded me of a basement after a flood. The tunnel curved left, then right, like it had been added in pieces over the years without any real planning. As I walked, the noise from above dissolved completely, replaced by the echo of my own footsteps bouncing off the walls in uneven patterns. That echo wasn't consistent, though. Every few seconds there was a second sound trailing mine, not synchronized, not repeated in the same rhythm. It felt like someone ahead of me was adjusting their pace on purpose. I kept calling Marissa's name, but the tunnel swallowed my voice, smothering the edges of it. The air grew heavier as I moved deeper, and the yellow bulbs blinked more frequently, making the whole place pulse like a heartbeat I wasn't part of. Eventually, the narrow passage opened into a larger service room filled with old equipment and cables, coiled across the floor like abandoned ropes. In the center of the room, a utility cart sat turned on its side, and behind it was a small alcove, no wider than a closet. I saw movement, tiny, hesitant, like someone pulling their hand away from the light. When I stepped closer, Something shifted inside the alcove and a person rushed out, stumbling into me with so much force that we both slid across the dusty floor. It was Marissa. Her eyes were wide and unfocused, her voice scratchy from screaming in a place where no one could hear her. She kept saying someone had grabbed her wrist in the crowd and steered her toward the doorway, guiding her with this unsettling confidence, like they'd done it before. Before I could make sense of any of it, a shadow moved in the far corner of the room, a figure stepping back into darkness the moment our eyes met. The outline was tall, shoulders stiff, posture deliberate. Whoever it was didn't run. They simply retreated into a side passage with the slow certainty of someone who knew the layout far better than we did. I grabbed Marissa's arm, and we bolted in the opposite direction, retracing our steps through the tunnel as fast as our legs allowed. When we reached the doorway, 2 transit officers were already there, alerted by a station tech who'd seen the door open on his monitors. They pulled us out, locked the entrance, and called for backup, while Marissa tried explaining what had happened in broken, trembling sentences. Hours later, after statements, after medical checks, after far too many questions, one of the officers told us something that has stayed with me ever since. Security footage from the metro entrances showed multiple individuals being subtly redirected toward that same locked doorway throughout the night. The person doing it blended perfectly into the crowd each time, never touching anyone long enough to draw attention. They waited for moments when fireworks exploded, when the crowd surged, when no one was looking at anything except the sky. The police never found the person in the tunnel. They searched every inch before sealing it permanently, welding the door shut so no one could enter again. Marissa and I moved out of the city a few months later, and to this day, we don't talk about that night unless someone asks why we never attend public countdowns anymore. I still have her scarf folded in a drawer, and even now I check every doorway near a station before I walk past it. The drive home after the New Year fireworks usually felt like a small ritual for us. Windows cracked open to let out the smell of sparklers, heater buzzing, and my daughter half asleep in the back seat with one of her boots off. That night, though, the road cutting past the old industrial lots seemed darker than usual, like the streetlights were taking turns failing. I remember leaning forward in my seat, trying to make sense of the shapes outside while my brother, Mark, joked about how the town somehow looked older every year. We weren't in a hurry, just easing our way back after visiting relatives, still carrying that warm, tired feeling you get when the night went longer than planned. Nothing about that moment hinted that things were about to take such a sharp turn. The quiet in the car was almost comforting until Mark muttered something and tapped the brakes. At first, I thought he had slowed down because of debris on the shoulder, maybe some leftover fireworks or a bag that fell from someone's truck. But as the headlights stretched farther across the pavement, a shape stood out, too still, too human. The figure lay close to the gravel line, one arm bent under the body, and the other stretched out like they'd been trying to reach the grass. My chest tightened as I leaned closer, half afraid of seeing a face. The person's jacket had this strange, reflective strip that caught the light, not the kind used on work coats, more like one someone had sewn on themselves. Mark didn't say a word for a solid 5 seconds, just gripping the wheel with this tense calm that only appeared when he was trying not to scare the rest of us. When he pulled onto the shoulder, the car rolled to a stop with a slow crunch of gravel, and I could feel that eerie stillness sink in, the kind that makes every small sound seem louder. The air outside looked thick, almost muffled, and the only movement came from the blinking hazard lights reflecting off bits of broken pavement. Mark told me to stay in the car while he called emergency services, but I stepped out anyway, keeping a few feet behind him. The person on the ground didn't move at all, not even a twitch. There was this odd detail I can't shake. One of their shoes was several feet away, resting upright as if someone had set it down deliberately. Mark kept his voice steady while talking to dispatch, but the way he kept glancing around made it clear he sensed something wrong lurking beneath the surface of what we were seeing. By the time the first patrol car arrived, the officer barely had to look twice before asking us to step back. He walked along the shoulder with a flashlight angled low, sweeping slow, like he expected the ground to tell him a story. It didn't take long for him to find the tire marks, deep, curved impressions cutting across the gravel in a pattern that didn't match a simple accident. Another officer showed up, then a third, and soon they were moving with that clipped urgency people get when they realize they're not dealing with a random tragedy. One of them asked if we'd heard anything earlier, an engine revving, a shout, anything. But the night had been quiet besides the last echo of fireworks. When they told us it looked deliberate, the weight of it settled in so suddenly that even Mark stopped trying to keep his composure for my sake. The neighborhood surrounding that stretch of road slowly came alive as word spread that police were investigating something serious. People stepped out onto porches still wearing party hats, jackets thrown over pajamas, champagne flutes in hand. I remember a woman with a bright red scarf wrapped twice around her neck pointing down the street and telling an officer she'd heard a truck tearing through just after midnight. She described the engine as strained, like someone pushing it harder than it could handle. Another neighbor, an older man leaning heavily on a cane, mentioned seeing headlights swerving near the stop sign moments before disappearing into the dark. The officers marked every detail down, but the way they exchanged glances made it clear these accounts were aligning in a way they didn't like. While they continued gathering statements, one of the detectives, tall guy, narrow face, hair pulled back so tight it almost looked lacquered, approached us. He had this habit of pausing 2 seconds before speaking, as though mentally filtering every sentence. He asked again about the moment we first saw the figure, about the shoe lying away from the body, about how long we'd been parked. Mark answered most of it, but the detective kept watching me as if he wanted a second version of the night to compare against the first. I told him everything I remembered. The sudden stillness, the way the jacket reflected oddly, the absence of skid marks where a driver might have tried to brake. He nodded slowly at each detail, his expression tightening only when dispatch radioed something that made him stiffen and walk off without explanation. A few minutes later, something shifted among the officers, an almost electric ripple of urgency. Additional patrol cars pulled up, and the detective with the lacquered hair returned, now moving faster and speaking with clipped precision. He explained that a missing person alert had just come in from a town a little over an hour away. The description matched the person lying by the shoulder. According to the alert, the individual had been involved in a bar fight earlier that night, one that escalated more violently than anyone there expected. Someone had stormed out afterward, threatening to finish things, and witnesses mentioned a beat-up pickup truck with a dented passenger door speeding away from the parking lot. Hearing that made the scene in front of us tilt into something far heavier than a tragic coincidence. As they processed the information, the truck sightings from the neighbors suddenly snapped into focus for the investigators. The older man with the cane clarified that the truck he'd seen seemed lifted higher than usual, with mismatched headlights, one bright white, one dim and yellowish. The woman with the red scarf added that she noticed a long scrape along the passenger side as it raced past, illuminated briefly by leftover fireworks, smoke hanging low in the air. The detectives exchanged looks with the kind of realization that carries both clarity and dread. Everything was pointing towards someone who knew exactly what they were doing, someone who had chased this person down and used the dark, empty stretch of road as their stage. Standing there, watching the officers pace along the shoulder, I kept replaying the moment we first spotted the figure on the ground. The noise from distant parties had faded by then, leaving the scene oddly quiet, except for the steady hum of police radios. A gust of wind carried the faint popping of leftover fireworks from somewhere deeper in the neighborhood, but it only made the silence feel sharper. Mark leaned against the car, rubbing his jaw, staring at the tire impressions like he expected them to rearrange themselves and reveal something new. Even though we didn't know the victim personally, the weight of what had happened hung over us with this heavy, intrusive presence, as if the road itself had absorbed part of the violence. As the paramedics prepared to transport the victim, the lead detective pulled Mark and me aside. He told us they'd found fragments of blue paint embedded in the gravel, consistent with the description of the pickup from the bar fight. He also mentioned that fresh footprints had been discovered near the grass, scattered and uneven, suggesting the victim had tried to run before collapsing. Something about the way he said it made my chest tighten again. Not from fear, but from the realization. that the person had likely seen the truck bearing down on them. The detective asked if we were willing to give statements at the station later that week, and we agreed immediately. It didn't feel like a choice, it felt like something we owed to the person who never made it past that patch of road. We eventually drove home in near silence, each of us locked in our thoughts. The heater clicked occasionally, filling the car with that dry warmth that usually felt comforting. But that night it just felt wrong, mismatched with the mood. When we passed through the last intersection before our street, I caught myself scanning every approaching set of headlights, searching for mismatched beams or a lifted frame. It was an involuntary habit that stuck with me for weeks afterward. Even my daughter, who had slept through most of the ordeal, sensed the tension the next morning when she asked why everyone seemed extra quiet. Mark and I just exchanged a look, neither of us wanting to explain something we barely understood ourselves. A few days later, the detectives called to let us know the pickup had been found abandoned behind an old storage facility 2 towns over. The driver had fled on foot, leaving behind a mess of fingerprints and a cracked phone still logged into social media. By the end of the week, they'd taken a suspect into custody, someone known for losing control when drunk, someone who'd reportedly left the bar swearing they weren't done yet. Hearing that brought a strange mix of relief and frustration. Relief because the person wouldn't hurt anyone else. Frustration because knowing the motive didn't make the scene on that roadside any easier to forget. We gave our statements, answered every question, and did what little we could. But even now, whenever New Year's comes around, I find myself thinking of that quiet stretch of pavement and hoping no one else ever ends their night the way that poor soul did. By the time that New Year's Eve rolled around, I'd been juggling too many things at once. My job at a small marketing firm, a shaky relationship I was trying to stabilize, and a general sense that I needed one night to just breathe. So when my friend Lucas dragged me to a house party across town, I figured a few hours away from everything wouldn't hurt. The place belonged to one of his co-workers, a guy I barely knew, and the house was packed with people leaning on countertops, laughing too loudly, clutching cheap champagne in plastic cups. I remember noticing the decor, random thrift store paintings mixed with those battery-powered candles that flicker like they're trying too hard. It felt like every room had a different playlist competing with the next. At some point, while I was standing near a doorway trying to cool off, a woman I'd never seen before approached me. Not casually, she stepped in close like she already knew me. She had sharp, restless eyes and this odd habit of tapping her thumb against her index finger like she was counting seconds. She asked my name, then immediately asked if I wanted to go somewhere quieter with her. I told her I wasn't interested and tried to be polite about it, but she didn't take it well. She leaned in closer, said something under her breath that I couldn't understand, and then walked away so abruptly it almost felt theatrical. I remember watching her disappear into the crowd and feeling an uneasy pressure in my chest, like I'd accidentally broken some unspoken rule. Nothing else weird happened at the party. I went home after midnight, fell asleep on the couch still wearing my jacket, and woke up the next morning to a phone that wouldn't stop vibrating. At first I assumed it was Lucas sending me blurry pictures from the night before. Instead, it was a string of messages from friends asking what the hell I had done. A couple of them weren't even subtle. One told me to explain myself fast. My stomach tightened as I unlocked the first link someone sent. It led to a brand new social media profile using a grainy selfie of me from years ago, slapped beside a long post claiming I'd assaulted a woman at the party. No details, no name attached, just enough vagueness to let people fill in the gaps themselves. Within an hour, the post had been shared into circles I didn't even know I was part of anymore. Old classmates, co-workers, neighbors. People who hadn't spoken to me in years suddenly felt comfortable chiming in with half-baked judgment. My girlfriend didn't answer my calls. Even my boss left a voicemail saying we needed to talk immediately. What really rattled me was the confidence in the fake profile's tone, as if whoever wrote it had practiced mimicking my voice. They added small things only someone who'd observed me closely would know. References to my jacket, The specific drink I'd been holding, the room I'd been in. None of it proved anything, but it painted a picture vivid enough for people to believe whatever they wanted to believe. I kept trying to reach people who knew me well, hoping someone would slow down long enough to hear me out, but most conversations shut down before they even started. One longtime friend sent a single message saying, "Man, this looks really bad," and then vanished offline. Even Lucas, who'd been at the party with me the entire night, hesitated when I called. He told me he hadn't seen anything happen, but that a couple of people claimed the woman I'd spoken with had left the house crying. That detail didn't match anything I remembered, but it was just specific enough to feed the spreading rumor. After we hung up, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall, trying to make sense of how fast the whole situation had taken on a life of its own. My first instinct was to track down the post's creator, so I dug into the fake profile. Whoever made it had gone to great lengths to hide their tracks. The account had only one friend, an empty-looking profile created on the same day. No personal photos, no background info, not even the usual list of random liked pages, just post after post pushing the same accusation, worded slightly differently each time, almost like they were testing which version would get the most traction. I tried reporting it, but the platform's automated system brushed it off, claiming they found no violation. Seeing that message felt like watching a door lock on its own while I was still standing outside. That afternoon, things got worse. My girlfriend finally called, her voice tight and clipped, asking me to stay at my place for a while so she could think clearly. I could hear chatter in the background, her sister, maybe a friend, feeding her their own interpretations while she tried to talk to me. I kept replaying every second of the night in my head, searching for anything that could have been misunderstood, but nothing fit the story being told. The woman from the party had barely spoken to me beyond that strange interaction. The more I tried to explain this, the more it sounded like I was dodging blame, like I was constructing a narrative instead of just telling the truth. By early evening, someone had taken screenshots of the fake profile and reposted them in a community group connected to my workplace. Colleagues I'd never interacted with were now leaving comments wondering if the company would take appropriate action. When I tried logging into my work email to get ahead of it, I found my access temporarily suspended. That was the moment a kind of heavy electric tension settled in my chest, because it became obvious that whoever targeted me wasn't just stirring up trouble for fun. They were pushing everything toward a point where I'd be isolated, discredited, and unable to defend myself. And the scariest part was realizing that the only person at the party who'd acted strangely was the same woman, whose name I still didn't know. I decided to go back to the house where the party had taken place, hoping someone there might remember the woman, or at least give me her name. When I pulled up, the place was noticeably quieter than the night before. A couple of empty cups were still scattered in the yard, and faint music played from somewhere inside, like someone had forgotten to turn off a speaker. The host, a guy named Trevor, answered the door looking groggy and confused, wearing a hoodie with a faded logo and holding a half-eaten granola bar. When I asked if we could talk, he let me in but kept glancing at his phone as if expecting the conversation to go sideways. I explained everything as calmly as I could, watching his confusion shift into discomfort. When I mentioned the woman who had approached me, he paused as if searching his memory for something that wouldn't come. He said he didn't recognize the description at all. Sharp eyes, constant tapping, that weirdly rehearsed way she spoke. He insisted he'd never invited anyone like that and would have remembered if she'd caused any trouble. The more he denied knowing her, the stranger the situation felt. He finally admitted that a few people had mentioned seeing someone crying near the bathroom, but nobody could agree on what she looked like. Some said she wore a dark jacket, others insisted it was light-colored. One person swore she had short hair, while someone else was adamant she had long hair pulled into a braid. It was like people were describing 4 different women. As I left the house, I called Lucas again and asked if he could meet me somewhere quiet. He showed up at a small coffee shop near the river, looking uneasy but trying to be supportive. I walked him through everything I'd found so far, and he leaned forward with both elbows on the table, tracing the rim of his cup with one finger while he listened. When I mentioned the conflicting descriptions of the woman, he nodded slowly and said something that stuck with me. It's like she wanted attention, but not an actual identity. That phrasing hit harder than he probably intended. The idea that someone could deliberately move through a crowd leaving such scattered impressions, barely consistent, yet memorable enough to weaponize, made the whole situation feel less random and more deliberate. On my way home, I decided to check the fake profile again, half hoping it had been taken down. Instead, I found a new post pinned to the top, a long message claiming I'd threatened the woman after she tried to get help. They even added a timestamp suggesting the argument had happened around the same moment I was outside talking with Lucas. The post included a blurry photo of the back of my jacket taken from an angle I didn't recognize. I hadn't felt watched at the party, but clearly someone had been paying very close attention to me. And seeing that picture, slightly tilted, taken from a doorway, made me realize that whoever started this had been close enough to brush past me without me ever noticing. When I got home, I called my brother, who's usually the level-headed one in the family, hoping he'd give me some unbiased perspective. Instead, he sounded wary, like he was choosing every word with caution. He told me he believed me, but he also said the situation was bigger than either of us expected. Someone had messaged him anonymously with screenshots before I even reached out, urging him to take distance for everyone's sake. Hearing that made something tighten behind my ribs. Not fear exactly, but a sharp awareness that the person behind this wasn't just tossing accusations into the void. They were reaching into my life with surgical precision, touching people I trusted before I could. I ended the call feeling like the walls of my life had shifted a few inches inward. That night I barely slept. Instead, I sat on my couch with every light on, scrolling through the fake profile again and again, trying to find a crack in it. Around 3 a.m, a comment appeared under one of the posts, an account I didn't recognize tagging another person and saying, "Isn't this what you warned us about?" Curious, I clicked on the commenter's profile. Buried in their old posts was a picture from the New Year's Eve party, taken in the kitchen. In the corner, near a stack of red cups, stood the same woman who had approached me. Same restless hands, same intense stare. The photo was time-stamped hours earlier than when she spoke to me, but her expression was identical, like she'd been maintaining the same mask all night. And beside her stood someone I did recognize, Trevor, the host, laughing at something off camera. The next morning I went back to Trevor's house unannounced. This time he looked more alert, almost expecting me. When I showed him the picture, the color drained from his face. He admitted he remembered the moment it was taken and said the woman had shown up with a coworker of his, a guy I'd met once years ago at a different event. Someone I barely remembered. Someone who, according to Trevor, had left the party early without saying goodbye. That thread unraveled fast. I looked up the coworker's old posts, and the pattern hit me in an instant. Comments he'd made about people getting away with things, vague rants about being overlooked, and several posts hinting at grudges against people who acted superior. It wasn't solid proof, but it was enough to piece together a disturbing possibility, that he'd orchestrated the entire thing out of resentment, using a stranger with enough social camouflage to stir chaos without being remembered clearly. I confronted him online, sending a long message laying out everything I'd connected. He never replied, but within an hour, the fake profile disappeared, and all the reposts from the secondary account vanished as well. My work access was restored the next day. My girlfriend came over that evening, and the tide of outrage slowly drifted away as people realized the posts were gone. Nobody apologized, and nobody admitted they'd been quick to believe a stranger over me. The whole situation just dissolved, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the accusations themselves. To this day, I don't know whether the woman was part of it or just someone he manipulated into playing a role. But every New Year's Eve since then, I catch myself scanning every room a little too carefully, wondering how close someone can stand without you noticing the damage they're about to cause.